Good morning, everybody. We're going to get the second student data privacy work group to start. And first item on the agenda is to do introductions. We have a few changes and additions to our work group. And so we'll start with the work group, but then we'd like each member of the audience just to let us know who you are, and if you'd like to indicate who you represent, that'd be helpful too. And I'll start that by saying my name is Peter Tromba, and I'm the Director of Policy and Research for the Oregon Education Investment Board.
I'm Lou Frederick, and State Representative for North and Northeast Portland, and on the Education Subcommittee for Ways and Means.
Betty Reynolds, I'm Vice President for Legislation for Oregon PTA, and I'm also a member of Oregon School Boards Association and a local school board.
Mario Parker-Milligan, Legislative Director for the Oregon Student Association.
Elizabeth Cox-Brand, I'm the Director of Student Success and Assessment for the Oregon Community College Association.
Ben Tate, I'm the Chief Information Officer for the Oregon Department of Education.
Betsy Salter, Oregon Save Our Schools.
Cinnamon Allen, I'm a Senior Business Analyst for the state's Chief Information Security Officer.
Jen McCollum, the Legislative Director for the Oregon Department of Education.
I'm Chuck Bennett, Director of Government Relations for the Confederation of Oregon School Administrators.
I'm Steve Langford. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the Beaverton School District.
I'm Pam McVeigh. I'm the Project Manager for the Integrated Client Services Data Warehouse for the Department of Human Services, Oregon Health Authority.
I'm Bob Karen with the Oregon University System Institutional Research.
And then in the audience, if you wouldn't mind starting, we'll just go around the rows.
Chip Craven with the National Trade Association called PEC America, representing the private sector.
Kelsey Wilson with Gallatin Public Affairs. I represent Facebook and Nike.
Good morning. I'm Christine Vogel with the League of Women Voters.
Hi, I'm Terry Neckerston. I'm the Information Security Manager for Portland Community College.
I'm Leslie Reister. I'm the Chief Information Officer for Portland Community College.
Kristen Benson, Interim Registrar at Portland Community College.
I'm Jody Potter, Student Systems Manager, Portland Community College.
Chris Allman, citizen of Oregon.
I'm Pat Burke. I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Administration at Portland State. We also do the data analysis work for the Regional Achievement Collaborative in Multnomah County.
I'm Gary Dacklin. I'm a programmer with Oregon for Information System.
I'm Matthew Bell, the lead content person for the Oregon Information System.
Cheryl from Attorney General's Office for Privacy Issues.
Chelsea Clinton, Research Analyst, ODE.
Bill Fitzgerald for Software Developer.
Project Manager at OEIB.
Al Pierce, Director of Information Systems, Department of Community Colleges and Workforce Development.
And the folks on the phone, if you could introduce yourselves and who you represent, if you choose.
This is Phil Barnhart, State Representative from House District 11. Good morning, Lou. I would ask that as you do your work, you speak up as if you're in a very large room so that those of us on the phone can hear. Thank you.
This is Mike Chambers at the Oregon Alliance of Independent Colleges and Universities.
Ian Green, Oregon Secretary of State, Senior Auditor.
Fauzi Nath, Chemeketa Community College.
This is Margot Lalich. I'm Director of School Health Services for Multnomah ESD.
Otto Shell, Oregon PTA.
Anyone else on the phone?
Good morning, everyone. This is Christy Alberti with Chalkboard Project in Portland, Oregon.
Good morning. This is Brent Jacobson with the Oregon Department of Education. I'm the Career and Technical Education Data Owner.
Okay, those of you on the phone, please remember to mute unless it's time to ask questions. And before we kick off, I want to make sure just to thank you to two staff members at OEIB who've helped put this together. Angela Bloom over here as the key contact for all of you who are on the committee and also sending it out statewide. And it's going to be one of our key technical helpers during the meeting. And also Chen Fei Lai, who's in the back here. Chen Fei actually prepared the first report that went out to the group and has subsequently updated the report to an extent where we can't even print it anymore. It's so large. So there's actually electronic documents that we were not able to print just because of their size or because of how much paper we would use. But it's evidence of the tremendous amount of existing work on this exact topic in Oregon and across the country, including the federal government and the work that they're doing. So Chen Fei will be working with the whole group a little bit later with some of the tools that she's created, but she's done a ton of research, so thank you. Looking at the agenda, just so folks can see where we're going, the first step was a request from the group to the Oregon Department of Education regarding what data is collected currently in the K through 12 system and why that's collected. And so Ben Tate is going to give us a presentation there. And I'm sure we're all going to have lots of questions for Ben as a result of that. And he's got a ton of information, so we see that's going to be critical to our discussion. The second part of the agenda is going to be a more thorough examination, item by item, for the things that were raised in our first meeting regarding data use, data privacy, data security, and data integrity. And a question I think that Chuck Bennett brought up and others also echoed was if we're going to work in each of these areas, which of these are areas of law, and where there are laws already, Cinnamon was a big help in where there are laws already, and where there are places maybe where there needs to be new law. Which of these are really rules, administrative rules, and again, where there are rules already, and maybe where there are places that rules need to be written. And then similarly with respect to individual districts, community colleges, or universities, where it's a policy, more of a local policy issue that's either in existence or not in existence yet. And we do have a conceptual framework that we're going to walk through on that and attempt to get input from the committee on each of those questions as best as possible. That's going to give us some key guidance as we take our next steps. And that could take a considerable amount of time because there's a lot of issues here that were raised in the first meeting. So I'm just going to ask from the work group before we get started, are there questions about the agenda or anything that we need to make sure that we at least add to it, even if it's a short report that you were expecting to see that you're surprised is not there?
Excuse me, hi, I just wanted to mention that I'm joining the call. This is Cynthia Starkey from Portland State. I had the wrong call-in number on my meeting invitation, so I apologize for being late.
No problem, Cynthia. You haven't missed anything but the intro. So thank you for joining us. And with that, you bet. I'll turn it over to Ben Tate, Oregon Department of Education.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So I am going to take you through kind of current state for Oregon Department of Education. I'm going to start with the current legal protections that all of our data collections are governed by. Most of these are federal laws, but there are a few state requirements as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about the type of data that we do collect, the type of data we don't collect, and then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about how we handle data sharing, handling, storage, and protection. So to start off with, our current laws governing. So there's a large variety of rules and regulations that in some way, shape, or form impact the data that we collect. So I'm going to start with a few that are more fringe for our data and then work towards some of the central ones. So COPPA is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And this one really is after children under 13 and making sure that their information, they're not being marketed to, or their information is not registered with any outside vendor without explicit parental consent. So any program or online application that school districts use for children under this age, there has to be a specific opt-in versus a specific opt-out for children. So this applies to Google Apps for Education. This applies for any other application, whether it's directly related to marketing or not. So the idea is that This information is not taken or sold and used for marketing purposes at all. So you can kind of just see real quick, really the large goal here is that expresses direct parental consent for any submission of this information. And the districts have to be explicitly clear on what information is going out and why.
Peter, if you have a question, can we ask during this?
that'd be fine.
Does this purely cover commercial use of the?
This one is specifically, commercial.
So it doesn't protect the data in other uses, like research or other?
Correct. That's governed by a different one.
Different one, okay.
This is really the commercial.
Okay.
I have two questions. One is, have we had any enforcement of this? And what have been the consequences if we've had anybody violate this?
You know, I don't know, Steve, if you're aware of any. I'm not aware of any, at least in my tenure.
I'm not.
Okay.
I can tell you from, at least at the district level, this is something that we feel responsibility for and we monitor. So we put into, for example, our enrollment verification form, our enrollment forms, kind of making sure that in addition to students utilizing these services, for example, Google Apps for Education, we're also collecting that information to make sure that we seek parent permission. In some instances, not in all, I would say.
What comes to mind for me are the not the catalogs, but the parent lists of kids for in a school, an elementary school. Who gets that? I have seen it used by commercial groups at different schools in the Portland School District. This goes back a ways, but I have seen it used where they get a list of the kids, the list of the parents, and an ad goes out to them talking about selling something or being involved in some program. And it's a directory. That's what the word I was trying to.
Student directory.
Student directory. Is this covered? Does this kind of thing cover the student directory? And if not,
right.
That's a commercial use of that kind of information that's there.
So the student directory information is a topic we'll hit when we talk about FERPA, which is really the large focal point. That'll be the last one that we cover.
I understand that, but my point is that this does not cover student directory information.
Correct.
And so, okay, that's a concern.
I'm a little embarrassed to ask this, but as a parent, I don't have a recollection of ever signing a form to opt in.
Well, it would only be if your local district had a specific program where that would fall under this. So some districts don't. I mean, if the district is not using Google Apps for Education or any other online program, then you wouldn't.
So it would be an explicit form. It wouldn't be buried in other stuff.
Yeah, it'd be an explicit form.
It might help for an example. So an example where I believe, and I might be incorrect, so if I am, let me know. But my kids used to play on a site called Club Penguin. So that was a site they would go to. It was an online community. They'd play games. I had to approve their ability to utilize that site because they were under 13. Would that be an example then of how COPPA would be applied, comes into play?
Yep.
But an online version of a directory does not apply here.
Correct, because that would be, the school would be housing the information versus the information getting entered into an external vendor or an external site. Now, whether the school, so the school may disclose that?
Well, that's my point. I mean, you go to a school's site from outside and it has the directory there.
Right.
Then I would think that would apply here.
I think board policy JOA and JOB govern what is considered student directory information.
Right.
And I know that our school board decided what was in student directory information, and that governs the data that goes into that report is shared, and use around it. So I think that's done at least in our district, that's done at a school board level through board policy and administrative regulation.
I know in our school district, we have to, it is basically an opt-in. It's like, here's the directory and this is what will be published. And you consent to whatever you want, you do and don't want, whether it's names or emails or anything else. It's up to the parent to choose what's in that directory. And we know where it's going to be.
Yeah, and like I said, there is a specific slide coming up about directory information, but under FERPA, there are certain categories of information that are allowed to be disclosed by the district, and it is a district-by-district decision on which of those they do disclose.
And if I could jump in, I think this is one of the most central questions for the committee to examine, is that directory information designation allowing individual districts to do that existed long before the current ability to copy and forward out stuff like this. So it's a hot topic, exactly what we're going to do, if anything, about that, but it's the crux of a lot of our discussion.
Well, and for me, it's the triangulation that can take place. If you have the name of a child at a particular age, you can also go and get the birth certificate issues or birthing from the different hospitals in that particular area. And we saw this take place before we had a major internet situation where by way of getting the names and the name of a child, you could then triangulate that with where they were, if they were still living in the same address or not, and you could get information about that particular child and family. And it's been used, it was used more, and the last time that I was dealing with it, was being used primarily by the military recruiters who were determining the age of certain kids and then going and sending information directly to them. Trying, because that was at the time when Portland was dealing with, had outlawed military recruiters in the schools. So they were going to the hospital records to determine what age certain kids might be. So it's a kind of the information on one spot is not just, it's not, just because you do not get all the information at one spot, it is possible to get it from other places. And this is the concern here. Thank you.
Okay. So just touch on HIPAA real quick, because we do deal with a limited number of information and data that falls under HIPAA. And this specifically deals with mostly our special education kids and some of the diagnosis codes. So obviously for all of that level of data, we're under HIPAA and under those rules and regulations about disclosure and being very careful and sensitive about who sees that piece of data. Free and reduced lunch is another piece that we're collecting. So this local school district collects some very detailed information about income to qualify kids. So I'll stress that what we collect is only a yes/no in terms of participation. We do not collect any of that financial information. All we know is the kids and whether or not they're in it participating. This is obviously, because we're dealing with income information, this is very sensitive, and so typically all we do with it is that aggregate data, which you'll see on the school report card. So and a variety of other publications, you'll see what the percentage is free and reduced lunch for a district or a school. That number is used in a number of federal programs in terms of benefits. So there's a program called E-Rate that uses that to provide financial reimbursement back to those districts based on the free and reduced rate of the individual district or schools for telecommunications. And there's a variety of other programs that use this number. So last but not least, FERPA. And as Peter mentioned, so FERPA was originally passed in 1974. So and it exists today without what I would say is any major revisions. So obviously the original drafting and verbiage did not take into consideration any of the things that we deal with today. So really the gist of FERPA is that student information should only be viewable to the people that actually absolutely have a business need to view it and use it. So we're talking about education officials primarily. Students do have the right under FERPA to review their educational records, prevent disclosure, so any of the things, even directory information, and we'll get to that in a moment, that are allowed to be disclosed, parents and students have the right to say we do not want that information disclosed. Now, whether or not that knowledge is prevalent is another topic, but under FERPA, those rules do exist. They can seek amendments to the records if they are inaccurate, and be notified of their privacy rights under FERPA that these things do exist. So here's directory information. So the way FERPA is worded, this level of information can be disclosed without parental consent beforehand, with the caveat that I just mentioned. Parents do have to be notified that this is happening and have the ability to say that they don't want it to happen, and the school has to honor that. But this information, student name, address, telephone, date and place of birth, honors and awards, and dates of attendance. And I've started dates and place of birth because that one, in certain instances, there are state laws that say that information cannot be shared. Oregon, however, does not have that law in place. So under FERPA, Oregon school districts could disclose that information without prior parental consent. And this is what I just said. Schools must tell the students and parents what they're including, and then honor any request to remove that information if a parent or student should request to do so. Yeah, there's that piece. So here's the piece that gets sticky, even stickier in terms of FERPA. So there are clauses that say that this information can be disclosed to other agencies or other bodies or other people other than the direct teachers and instructional staff for specific purposes. So I'm going to jump down to the bottom here. Organizations conducting research and specified officials for purpose of audit and evaluation of a program. So that's where ODE staff and OEIB staff under FERPA are allowed to see student level information because of the audit and evaluation of the programs. The other piece of this, so the upper portion is talking about so these are all what I would call fringe cases, instances where a student is transferring, so then we can disclose information from one district to another, where otherwise districts aren't allowed to see student information of each other. Just because you're an education official doesn't mean you get full rights to every student. It has to be specifically students that you're dealing with, except in cases where students are transferring. Appropriate officials for health and safety emergencies, so obviously we'll disclose specific information to health and safety personnel as appropriate. Financial aid, comply with obviously judicial orders, etc. So, and accrediting organizations. So the rules really are the way that ODE interprets and educates the districts is you have to be very, very careful. One of the examples that I was told early in my career with the school district is you can't even put on the wall of a school name and grades, because now you've combined two pieces of information which combine, while individually you could in theory disclose, the link of them together in a public place where someone who doesn't have direct need to see that information can't observe it is a FERPA violation.
Ben, I got to tell you, then we've got FERPA violations going on right now.
And we do.
Because I've been told that a number of schools have put up data walls
right.
that indicate the kids' names, where they scored on the various tests with a color coding of green, yellow, and red, with the names of the kids clearly there, grades, etc.
Right.
And that's going on not in one school, but from what I can gather across a whole, at least a couple of districts at this point. So this is, and they're being placed in places where anyone can walk in and just see them. How is that?
I would say
how
this
is it that this is not known as a violation at this point?
And I would say this is the biggest area of weakness in terms of knowledge of our school district officials is that they understand at a high level that they can't disclose, this information, but applications like that are not understood. And right now, it's as we become aware of those things, we have the conversations, but there's no proactive piece of this. It's really incumbent, I think, on the districts to educate their staff, and so that's.
But I've been told that the districts, and one district in particular, they were told by their administrative team to do these things.
Yeah.
And so this is not, I mean, it wasn't just a principal saying, I think I'll do this. It was, you will do this. And I mean, in addition, it really disturbs me that it makes it very clear to the teachers that the main thing is testing.
Right.
But that's another conversation to have.
Yeah.
But that this information is sitting there very public. And this is not digital information.
Right.
This is just walking into the teacher's lounge or into someplace, and you've got this on a big board that everyone can see.
Right.
Is it that the Department of Education or school board, who didn't get to them? Because they need to get to them right away, because it's a point where it's not just a concern, it's now being used as a joke by some of the teachers.
Right.
Because it's gotten that far.
Yeah, and under the current practice, it's really the local school districts that are supposed to be educating the staff and principals on the rules and regulations around FERPA, and I would agree that that's an area where we're getting really, really inconsistent results. One of the recommendations in there is for a chief privacy officer, and I would wholeheartedly support that for this reason more than any other, is to have a little bit of directed focus on these issues and to create education programs and stuff. Then we're establishing a consistent baseline for all school districts in terms of knowledge and then expectations to follow up on this.
Are there standards of security for local districts at this point that you publish to them? You know, this is really, I mean, above and beyond the pale where somebody literally putting it up on the wall.
Right.
But it's sort of behind the wall. What's the wall got to look like to protect these students' privacy, and what are the are there other pieces of information associated with this covered by FERPA? And I'm thinking of social security numbers, mother's maiden name, some of the other identity factors that are also included in these data packages, and then what level of security is there?
And it's really, I mean, maybe Steve, you can speak better than I can in terms of what you're hearing from us on guidance on these things. But I know that, you know, we'd really try and emphasize the principles, but then the application, so the technical security applications are very district by district.
And then are they agency, because, you know, I mean, ODE having a hold of it, OEIB having a hold of it, districts, ESDs, individual teachers. It sounds like just as a layman, it sounds like a free-for-all opportunity sitting there of really valuable information about individual Oregonians that is not being protected adequately. That's what it sounds like.
Well, and I can speak for us and for, you know, OEIB, is that the level of technical protection we put on this, you know, we've tried to maximize that at every turn. So every piece of the data is encrypted, not only at rest, but while it's in transit. Everything is secured by multiple factors, and only the people that should have access have access. I don't have access to student level information.
Are identity markers or codes, are some social security numbers and some other codes or anything like that?
We do not collect any social security numbers. We have a randomly generated SSID that's not tied to anything else in the student's life.
So no case for any student in Oregon would their social security number be in any way associated with that. I'm thinking just K-12, but associated, particularly when you're dealing with financial information of their parents and others.
I don't know if at a district level, we don't collect that, but.
You know, I could here just speak for us, and we don't. We utilize the state student ID just because, for that very reason. We have no social security numbers for students in our systems.
What about OEIB? What are you looking at?
Well, K through 12, no.
Okay.
The post-secondary, I was just saying to Bob Kieran, we probably need a complimentary presentation for higher ed, because the answers are different, starting with financial aid and going forward. At this point, we have no data whatsoever, but we will never have K through 12 SOC data.
Are you seeking data then, or what are you?
Yeah, we're still in the process of working to build and get approval for the longitudinal data system.
It may be, will you then be providing, as you come into the legislature, with a model of how data ought to be handled so that we, rather than sort of OEIB centered, a real model as to what this should look like, the kind of technology that will be in place, I mean, a real package of information that that really models how this should be done?
Well, for OEIB and for ODE, yes. I think one of the big concerns is we have the staff, the capability, and the expertise to do it tightly in a state agency, but often in a school district, we don't have that same understanding or technical ability. So I think one of the values of this group is all of the other entities holding that data. We have a plan for data security, as does ODE. It's very, very tight.
Well, these seem to be, though, the places where you read in the newspaper the data has been compromised, or in these big banks of data. Not so much, you don't hear about school districts so much as you hear about big banks of data being collected, or people walking out with it on their...
There's a lot of school districts around the country. It's not just Oregon. It's around the country. I mean, we follow all the breaches, and there's a great database for breaches within the U.S., and they do have a lot of school districts. And speaking for state agencies, you know, education and OEIB are under our umbrella, or there are security standards that are put in place.
If you're on the line,
down.
can you
They all
please
have a
mute your
minimum
phone?
standard to
Well,
meet, and
that
it's
would be
based on
really interesting, I think, understanding whether that is something that ought to be replicated out there. If you are confident that you have some sort of best practice,
yeah,
other than putting it on the wall with colored.
Well, let me go back to that. One thing, when you have a non-technical breach of privacy, like the walls, that doesn't give a lot of confidence to the idea that you're not going to have a technical breach of privacy, a technical breach of privacy. So we've got to think about it. I mean, I just encourage us to think about it that way, that we are in fact, not bringing a lot of confidence to the public and to parents in particular about how this is going to be handled.
The other piece of FERPA, which is, I think I see the most confusion on, relates to contractors as defined by FERPA. So FERPA defines that you're allowed to disclose student information without prior consent to people outside of the school district under very specific guidelines. And it's, outside entity hired to do a specific job or role that the school district would normally do, is under the direct control of the school district, has to sign all the same agreements that school district staff do, et cetera. When that was created in 1974, there were some very specific applications. In 2014, it gets really fuzzy. Does that mean that a school district can upload all of their information to a cloud vendor? Does it mean that they can host all of their information, with Amazon or with a different state agency? We have that question within our own state in terms of whether we can use the services of DAS to host information. Currently, we do not, because the prior ruling was that would violate FERPA. It's a huge gray area, which to date, at the federal level has not provided good clarity. They provided some clarity, but it's the biggest area I think school districts struggle with to determine what is okay under FERPA under those contractor guidelines and what's not.
And I'll go back to the two questions I asked earlier in terms of COPA. Have there been any enforcements of this? And if so, what have been the consequences?
And then I'm not 100%, I don't know.
So, I mean, my point really within that is that, yeah, you can sign these agreements.
Right.
But if there's no consequence, who suffers besides the person who's had their information sent out? Who suffers for violating that?
Yeah, and there are penalties associated with FERPA. I don't know if we've had any, I'm not aware of any violations in the last couple of years, but I don't know prior to that what has happened.
And I guess I have a follow-up, and I don't know if you know, does ODE have the authority if you were to discover something like this, or is that a local school board, local law enforcement responsibility?
I'm not sure.
Well, most of the federals are federally regulated, and most of them actually have had little enforcement activity. HIPAA is actually the one that's just now starting to actually invoke penalties that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of many FERPA actions that have taken place. So the federal government has done a great job of putting some of these in place, but then their enforcement and, you know, and their auditing haven't really come to fruition. And at the state level under FERPA, that's a federal regulation.
Right.
So I don't know what enforcement.
What I can tell you is I know right now that that's not something we do because it's not something that we had viewed as within our purview. So I don't know at the district level though.
No, I wouldn't know. I think we build, and again, this is just one district of many, but we build in trainings as we train staff. But then again, we have schools, multiple schools that we don't have the ability to monitor fidelity of practice throughout. So if there was a data wall that was up, what would be the process for us to identify that and educate them around that? We would have one, but again, that would be something that consistently we're not monitoring just due to the sheer number of classrooms in schools.
Now, one thing I want to mention is a former principal, when you have your Life Touch or another vendor come in and take student pictures, it's typical you provide them with a list by grade. So when the kids arrive, they've got their card and they get their picture. And I think in the 70s, that was what we were thinking about then. That was a trusted vendor, often local, and it made the picture, you didn't have kids in a long line. They got their pictures taken. And then companies like that went into the yearbook business. So then you now upload the names so that they flow into the yearbook. And a teacher who's really busy can get a yearbook done. So it's a creeping thing that's gone maybe past a certain point.
I would definitely agree that we're at a point where we need some review and additional work on FERPA, but that's beyond me. That covers.
Let me say, you're right. It is beyond what you can do right away. But if we don't have examples of where there's been a problem, then there's no one's going to take the next step. And so we have weekly, or maybe not weekly, but certainly monthly examples of data breaches. And if that's the case, who is then held responsible for those data breaches? When I was on the state board, we had this huge thing with this charter school that had the 5 that just left with all the information just sitting there. Again, responsibility for that is something that we need to be able to speak to.
I agree. So that really covers the major federal legislation that governs the data that we collect. So I'll just kind of cover at a high level some of the large bodies of data that we do collect, and then I'll cover what we don't collect. So for all students, this is what we typically call average daily membership, and we collect it quarterly, and then some of these flags we collect specifically. So this is where we get into directory information, so that name, address, date of birth, gender, ethnicity, courses taken but not grades. We don't collect any grades at this point. Attendance, test scores, and then there's a variety of yes-no flags. So one of the things that we just did recently as part of the 40-40-20 to start to measure that is what we call freshman on track. So at the end of your freshman year, have you earned enough credits that you're on track for graduation? So a quarter of whatever your district's graduation requirement is. And we don't get the number of credits, we just get a yes-no. Are they on track or not? Same thing with homeless. And then if they have indeed graduated in degree type, if it's the standard, modified, or extended diploma, we just get a yes, no on those. And
On these, you're talking about what's collected at the central?
At ODE, yes.
ODE, so a lot more data is collected at the...
Correct, at the individual districts.
I think we kind of need to keep those separate.
Yes.
Because as we move forward, there's big differences about
Right.
how things are impacted.
Right, so obviously the districts will have a central repository with grade information where we don't collect that, and credit information and specific, things like that we don't.
One more personal information, emergency contacts, doctor.
Yes. Yeah.
But disclosure applies to everybody along the chain.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yeah. And I think I mentioned last time, but as as we talked about the collections, every piece of data that we collect for specific state or federal requirements. So a lot of this data then does get reported up to the federal government at an aggregate level, so that we can, when we talk about ELL and SPED and things where there's federal funding attached to the numbers that we report on. And then at a state level, like Freshman on Track is a state level requirement that we have to start to report out progress towards 40-40-20. Discipline I know came up before, and this is a new collection for us. So we do collect, starting this school year, discipline information for specific incidents. So this is not, we won't collect information on a fight, but we'll collect information if the fight involves a weapon. Drugs, violent acts, that's what does get reported to us. And it is, we do get student level information on that, so it's going to be a student, and then the discipline code associated with that does get reported to us this year.
I have to speak to this at least a little bit. One of the clear issues is that minority students tend to be disciplined at a much higher rate than majority students.
Right.
And as a result, their individual information, a violent act or a violation of school rules could be simply saying no to one teacher, versus something else that was much more serious. And that ends up being a part of their record. And I'll say it again, the permanent record is no longer just a file in a file cabinet somewhere. It is in fact digital. That knowledge, that aspect can be important. A suspension at one school can be very different than a suspension at another school. And one of the key studies that's underway right now is to look at expulsions as well for students. Again, based on, they can be very different. They can be one school, so it can be basically a pat on a slap on the hand for one thing, when in another school it is an expulsion. And that inconsistency, especially tied to ethnicity and an economic level, can be really important. So just reporting that can be an important thing, and if you're collecting it individually, how long that is part of the record, who then has access to that when they apply for college, what kind of access to that kind of record is available at the middle school and high school level, I think is an important factor, and we haven't really dealt with that, and how that can be expunged.
Right.
It's something that I think we need to be paying close attention to.
And it is, yeah. I think we did this collection last year, and that the numbers that came back showed that very, very clearly about the inconsistency of what was being reported, how it was being reported, how different types of students were being treated. I totally agree.
Well, and let me say this, I understand it's also important to have that kind of data so that you know when you have this kind of discrepancy taking place. The balance is a real serious problem.
Yep. Yeah, and the data did really confirm that.
So we're redialing, and I just want to note this is one of our conundrums. We can't prove the racial bias without the data.
Right.
But then the data is racially biased.
Right.
So we have to try to balance that.
Yeah.
So as we do the dial-in, would just if you mind pausing for a second, Ben, thank you.
Sorry, we had a little glitch. Everybody's emails been down for a second, and apparently we dropped the call as well.
Okay.
Will we be able to get a copy of
Yeah, it'll be posted up on the web. I'm sorry we didn't get it up before, but it'll be up as soon as Ben's done. Angela will put it on up. Not a bad time to note, there's coffee, hot water and stuff over there. Folks want that, please partake. So 5-minute break, folks, while we work on our technical difficulty. If you brought lunch, now might be a good time to break it out. Voice conferencing is down.
Oh, yes.
We are no longer able to host the phone. We're working on that assiduously. We do not have a backup, unfortunately. The best we were offered was a single cell phone, which is not going to work well. So just for folks' information, this meeting is recorded. The recording will be put up online. If you hear Rep. Frederick hears from someone tweeting or something, that's the answer. As soon as we get it restored, we'll get it back. But we're going to continue with our presentation from where we left off. And next time, we'll have a better backup plan. My apologies for that. So, Ben.
Okay, picking up again on data collection. So this is general information collected for all students. The other slides are specific to what we refer to as subgroups, so different specific groups of students. So this is our English learner data collected just for students in that English learner. Man. They changed it. It used to be English language learner, ELL, and now it's just English learner. So I'm tripping up on the habit of saying all of it. So we just collect some specifics about the program, when the student became into the program, when they became proficient and graduated out of it. There's actually Peter mentioned this to me, there's some very interesting data that came out of this, in that if a student starts and graduates from the English learner program within high school, they have an incredibly high percentage of graduation, higher than really anyone else at that point. It fully exceeds students outside of that program. So it's an interesting note to show that students that make it out of here actually, the percentage that they graduate is significantly higher. So then there's some specifics in terms of how many years that they've been in the program and the supports provided. A lot of that data does get reported up as part of what we call our EdFax reports, which is the reports we send up to the federal government. Free and reduced lunch data we've talked about. We collect some very specific information about students, the students that are in this program, not any of the financial data. It's just a yes, no, whether they're in and participating in this program. So specifically, family name, schools collect this, family name and address, number of people in the household, family income. What we collect is just student name, yes, no. So a lot of this other additional information is at a school level, but not at an ODE level. And yeah, as I said, this is not, because we don't collect any of that. This is in a separate area from the rest of the student data that we collect, so not attached to that.
I do want to mention at the school district level, this data is only available to a very small number of folks. As the IT director, I did not have access to this. It was just the providers of the lunch program. And that's recent changes have made it much more restrictive who has access to that data at the district level because of the sensitivity of it.
There's also access controls in place for IT staff that have to be custodians of the data. There is a signed agreement between myself and Nutrition Services that's renewed every year, and it specifies a very, very small subset of staff who have access. And it's only because they must be custodians.
Yep. And that is true. That was true in my district, and most of the ones that I've talked to.
But there is something that's written, you need to make very clear. Because you're giving a profile of a school, if a school is 85% free and reduced lunch, there's a better guess that the student is coming from that free and reduced lunch segment. The flip side is another thing as well. So, although you may not know specifically the individual students, it is possible, again, to use other data to determine what the profile of the student might be.
Yeah, and I mentioned this earlier when I talked about free and reduced, that any of the data that's disclosed outside is only aggregate. Not even for research purposes is the student level information disclosed on this one. So there is some what we call direct certification. This is a connection with Department of Human Services. So students who are eligible to receive services such as TANF do get directly certified for free and reduced lunch. DHS sends us that information, the student names, and again, a yes, no, whether they're participating in the program. And then we match that to the student records that we get for free and reduced lunch. And we kind of get a composite from there. And that's what we use to report out those percentages. Special education data, so we report, this is a large area of federal funding is based on special education data that we report up to the federal government, including resident attending district, whether they're limited English proficiency, the disability codes, primary, secondary, and actually now we just recently changed, so it's like up to 5 disability codes that you can report on this. Related services, federal placement, if we need to do that, and specific other information that's related to just these kids. So this is also an area, obviously, where we're really sensitive about this data. Only our special education staff have access to this. My staff, again, are very limited. We've got things so that not all of my staff work on every data collection. We have specific staff dedicated to different collections, and so then the rights are based on those job duties. I mentioned before, I'm the head of the IT department. I could not get you any student level information because my job does not require that I have access to that, so therefore I do not have access. Same with my management team. Do not have access, except in one very specific case we'll talk about later, to that data. So here's some stuff that we do not collect. We mentioned Social Security number. It was something that was collected in the past, but as of 2007, we are not collecting any of that data. The data that we did have has been expunged from the system so that we don't run a risk of getting that data. School student grades, mentioned that too, that while the schools and districts maintain that, that is not something that we currently collect. Exception is in a rare case that a private school closes, the student transcripts do come to us, so we would have grade information in that rare instance. Medical records, this is just specifically related to, most of the time, our special education kids or kids that are considered medically fragile. We have a small number of kids that are in that group, and so we do have medical diagnosis information for those kids specifically, and only for the purposes of being able to provide direct services that the students need. And then, as I said, financial credit information, we do not. And the exception, the family income is only collected at a school district level and only under the circumstances and in the really, really small number of people that we mentioned. The other thing I'll mention when we talk about information and disclosure, there is also something that we call suppression on our aggregate reports. So while we report at an aggregate level on a lot of things, some of our districts are so small that it's very possible then to infer who the kids are when we report. So there's a threshold under which the numbers are suppressed. So if you see any of the information that gets reported at the state level, oftentimes for the smaller districts, there's just stars. And that's because the student counts were so low that if we reported on, even on the aggregate information, it would violate FERPA because you would be able to identify those students. So when we talk about access, I talked about the principle that it's strictly limited based on job duties and only to the specific collection. So the fact that you need access to one set of student data does not mean you get access to all student data. You only get access to the data that you specifically need. Special education is the example here. So our staff that work in that program only have access to that, not to the other students, all student collections, free and reduced lunch, or any of the other data. Our research analysts do have access to conduct some specific research, so they have a little bit different access in order to do that, but that's also something that we've kind of vetted and governed in terms of what access that they need for specifically the research that they're conducting. And then the assessment staff obviously have access to the test records that we conduct, the tests that we conduct at a state level, but they would not have access to any of the other student or program information. My staff, specifically, we've got some unique needs. So our service desk staff have some basic read permissions for the purpose of helping school district personnel when they're submitting the data collections. So every year we've got windows of data collections that we do, and we often have issues with districts in reporting. So these staff have the ability to go in to validate that the numbers have been reported and to answer any questions and help troubleshoot issues. Security manager. So this is the one member of my management staff that has some level of access to student data because she's the one that interacts with public safety when there's a specific judicial request or request from state police. And so she has access to provide them that data. She's the only one that has that access and can authorize that disclosure because there's some very specific purposes that is done. And then my data team that manages the data management structure, so they obviously have access to a higher level. This is probably the highest level of access because they're the ones that manage the system that collects the data. So now when we talk about non-ODE staff, and then I'm going to talk about this specifically and then some data sharing. So this is what we talked a little bit about with under FERPA, that there is some level of disclosure allowed of aggregate information for research purposes. We have a body within the Oregon Department of Education called the Data Governance Committee, which is made up of officials from all of the programs. Any request for research comes through that committee. There's some very specific guidelines about what can and cannot be disclosed. Some very specific things we're asking any of the folks that are proposing to use data. We want to see what they're researching on, what the methodology is, what are they expecting to find. All of those things have to get vetted through this committee before any data is disclosed. And then at a district level, every school district does have a specific security administrator that can grant school and district employees access to the data they have submitted to us. So even that aggregate, because at a district level, school personnel don't have access to other information at other schools or other grades. It's very limited. There are certain circumstances where at a district level, staff need to access the whole, but that's governed at each district level. And then we talk about transferring. So when we do the data collection, oftentimes two districts do report the same kid because in the time frame that's being reported, the kid transferred. And so we do have a process to go to validate when one district claims that they should be the authorized holder of record for a student, and we verify with both districts to make sure that that's true, and then we'll transfer the data from one district to another.
Could I ask you just on that one?
Sure.
Trying to demonstrate my ignorance, but how do the data warehouses work into that?
What do you mean?
Well, it seems like there are data collection points out at the at various ESDs. We've got large data collection going on. How does that fit into this narrative of yours relative to ODE, non-ODE, school districts? How do those fit in?
So the data warehouses are not used as a source of data for any of our collections. We still collect directly from the school districts for all of the data that I'm talking about here. And you actually run one of the regionals, right, Steve? So what, maybe I'll defer to you since you run it. Run one similar to what Chuck's asking about in terms of what you collect and how that's reported out.
Yeah, I think we use our data warehouse for in-district data reporting needs. So, for example, teachers will be creating student learning goals this year. We take assessment data, it goes in the data warehouse. It's a very easy and powerful way to represent data to teachers. So that is used internally. We do send data through up to what was called the KIDS project, the state data warehouse. And so there is a connection there. It is a subset of data points. And it's not used for state reporting.
It's really, yeah, it's not used for state reporting. And at this point, because that only covers, while it covers probably the majority of students, it's far short of the majority of districts. It's only mostly the regionals are here in the northwest corner of the state. So one of the things that we've been talking about recently is revisiting that structure and what the purpose is and how to, if we still need that. It's not used.
So you're not serving multiple districts?
No, our data warehouse would not.
There are others that
You go down to Lynn, Benton, Lincoln, and they're serving multiple districts.
But I think the purposes are the same.
Purposes, my understanding is the purposes are the same. It's really for district reporting needs. The reporting engines that we get with the tools we purchase through our student information systems, for example,
you are currently the only person in this
I would
conference.
categorize as not strong. They're transactional systems. They're designed to input data and process data with regards to, say, for example, enrolling a student. Or taking in grades. They're not great at, their strength is not in reporting data back to users, and our teachers have needs around seeing data. So in the example I just used from yesterday, as teachers are learning to set student learning goals this fall, they are looking for pre and post assessment data so that they can actually be informed and set goals that are meaningful around student growth. And so we would use a data warehouse in that context to provide them that data, but again, it's very tightly controlled to their student. In our example, the data source would be from the student information system, so what we're doing is taking that data and putting it to a system that better and more easily reports data back to the users.
Yeah.
So Chuck, in Eugene, we ran a regional data warehouse. They still run it, and that keeps Eugene, Springfield, Bend, LaPine, Coos Bay, and a couple other districts. As a Eugene person, I couldn't see Bend's data. So we had a data center, and Bend owned it. They logged into it. Their data security officer had control over it. We ran the machines as a data center because they didn't have the air conditioners and stuff like that. But we didn't see their data, and they couldn't see ours.
The only question I guess I'd have about it is it comes across as a highly decentralized system down to the district level collecting data. And again, just the sense I get that there is a lack of kind of a uniform or some sort of standardized protection of this information and a discipline that goes with it.
Yep.
That's the part I'm having a little trouble picturing as I hear about dissonant districts, the data warehouses, the potential for potentially using the cloud for storage. I mean, there's get this sense that people are collecting an awful lot of information on students, teachers, administrators, and sort of school district. And it's just not clear to me how this is all fitting together. It makes me nervous as we talk about then a whole new group coming in, OEIB, looking at data collection and research. And my God, when do we get enough data out there that, are we just missing the correct procedures for whoever appropriately needs this, or do we need to collect more and do we need to decentralize it more? That's,
So if
My
I
kid's 45 years old,
Yeah.
so we miss this whole thing with our kids.
If I could jump in some states, the way that this problem or issue's been solved is to have one database. Like Massachusetts, that's their solution. There's one database that individual school districts, community colleges, and universities, on a transactional level, put it into one data system, and then things can come out of that. It's really, really expensive. And when we looked at that for Oregon, it was around $120 million to start something like that. And what we heard in looking at stakeholders' input was a real desire in our state to have local control over this as much as possible. So I would agree with you that what comes from local control can be a patchwork. And then we're really relying on a Beaverton who has the capability to do it, and then maybe a smaller school district who doesn't, with the same rules, the same needs for teacher accountability, the same testing requirements, but very different ability to maybe meet those. So they do the best they can. It turns out really, really different. And I just want to say that anytime I voiced when I got up here last September the idea of one system for the state, I got tremendous pushback from local districts who thought that would be a terrible idea. So
Except we've been working on one central, the kids system. I don't know how many sessions I've been to Ways and Means hearings on this thing, and never heard where it was going, how it was getting there. I mean, it sort of feels like we ought to have Costi here talking with us about how that's going and how that all fits together.
Well, and that's the system that we're looking at, because it's really kind of now off to the side and not being actively used, and I don't think there is a future.
We spent session after session on this thing.
Right, and well, here's how it played out at the local level.
And it certainly wasn't local districts that stopped it. I would really reject that, because I would have been one of those people trying to kill it, and that isn't what went on. It was trying to figure out how to be cooperative in developing it and funding it.
I don't think that the districts actively killed it. I think that there was an uncertainty of what the need or the gain in contributing to it was. So what we've seen is that the data contributing to that has really fallen off. Yep. And so the data that's there is not quality, it's not current, which is why it's starting to fade off to the side, because it's an additional workload on districts to contribute this, and there's not a clear sense of why they're doing it. And so that's why we're looking at it. So it isn't a resistance, we don't want to do this, it's just we don't know why we should do this. And so it's kind of fallen off to the wayside.
I'm not sure it ever got explained to the legislature clearly enough why we should be doing it. They really were the funder and the deciders on this thing, certainly not local districts.
Okay, so we'll talk here a little bit about data protection. We kind of touched on this before. I mentioned that the data coming into our systems is encrypted while being transmitted into our systems, is encrypted the entire time it's there. Any of the backups that we do are also fully encrypted. We're behind the state system as far as firewalls, and then we've got our own security systems. We've got a kind of a dual layer there in terms of protection from the outside network. And then access is based, as I've said, on employee role and responsibility, and it's key to your login, so you can only access the data that you have direct permission to access. So we try really hard. This is an area, so if you talk to the folks in ODE, I will say that there's a lot of areas that we're underfunded, and understaffed. Data security is not one of them, at least at the ODE level. I would say that I made the comment that the recommendation here for a state privacy officer is something I really support, because I think outside is where we really need to push, but in terms of inside in our protection, I feel really safe and secure. And we've continued to put investment. The life cycle refresh there has been current. All of our information, all of our equipment is within those specs, and we work really hard to keep it up to date. Data sharing agreements. So there is a variety of different agencies that we do share bits and pieces of data with. I've mentioned the EdFax reports, which is our series of reports we make to the federal government every year. And it really is, just like everything else, is the type of data and how we handle it is governed by the same laws, and is really just based on the specific needs. So there's no instance where we're sharing all of our data in any circumstance. So we do kind of go over any procurement, any contract that we make is subject to review. Our research team is heavily involved in our data governance, which is the representatives of all of our business units, to make sure that the needs of all of these units are accurately reflected and the security and privacy concerns of all of the data is reflected in any of the contracts that we do. So I'll give you a couple of different examples. A variety of the universities, this is typically where we get our research requests from, are from the universities. And so we do disclose aggregate data to them when approved by the governance committee. USDA is where we do report some of the free and reduced lunch data to. It's a requirement of USDA that we report some of this information. U.S. Department of Ed at a federal level, that's our EdFax reports, and they use that for funding. So a lot of our federal funds, which is primarily special education and some of our title funding, all comes from these reports that we submit. Department of Human Services, they only get information for us in the instances of students who require medical care. Specifically, we're talking about Medicaid or Medicare students, so we're sending them student information for billing purposes for services provided. So it's a very specific instance where we're giving them data. And then we've talked about OEIB and some of the research. And I put it on here so we could talk, just to mention it. It's something that we're still working through and discussing what the appropriate data is to disclose to them for research. Some of the things that we don't, I know in the last meeting there was some conversation about employment department and the longitudinal data system. We do not share any data with the Department of Employment. At this point, the state longitudinal data system is something that's, I would call it in pilot mode. So that's a connection between K-12 and higher ed. We don't have any active data sharing because we're still working on the system itself. So there's no, if you would agree with that, there's no active data sharing going on with that system. An SLDS is a phrase, at a national level that gets used to apply to a variety of systems and types. So I think it's important just to provide the context for what Oregon means. So when I say SLDS, I really do mean connecting the data between K-12 and higher ed, and that creates what I will call the longitudinal record. There is obviously within our system, we do have what you could call a longitudinal record in K-12. So we can say, an individual student moving through the system, we can track, test scores and all of that. But outside of the system, there are no longitudinal records at this point. It's something we've talked about in that connection with higher ed, but there is nothing at this point.
So there's no expectation at the federal level that kind of tracking would take place?
Expectation, no. It's something that they have provided grants. They've encouraged states to do that, but there's not any sort of requirement for additional funding. It's all grant-based, so if we were to apply for a specific grant, they would ask us to do that, but there isn't anything like you have to do it in order to get your continuing operational funds.
But have we applied for grants?
We applied for a grant in the past, and that's what Project Alder is about, and making that connection. That's the one that, at this point, is not operational. The system is something that we've worked on and now are kind of in the final stages of fine-tuning, but we haven't worked through what that looks like when it becomes active.
Well, just a clarification, the longitudinal database required under Senate Bill 290, I know at the OEIB planning meeting in August, you mentioned that that OEIB's plans were to anonymize the data for research purposes.
Correct.
So could you clarify the two, yours sounds much more detailed.
Well, Alder is going to become SLDS. When the Alder grant was first created, OEIB did not exist, and so we were kind of marching down this path. But then when OEIB was created and that requirement in the Senate bill, what Peter and I have talked about is that this system becomes theirs. So there will not be a second system. What you've heard there is what the system will be.
But it's key to get on the table that it's anonymized. And Rep. Frederick's point's well taken about triangulation. I think suppressing data is something we could all learn more about. But the notion is that it should not be possible to resolve an individual out of it. It's meant to determine the outcomes for investments that we make in students making progress towards the Achievement Compact and 40-40-20. And if we invest $75 million in an objective in a certain area of the state, did it make a difference long term? But no person identifiable information.
Thank you.
That's pretty close to a point I wanted to bring up too as well. You used the term tracking in terms of the data. And the vast majority of, in fact, I believe all research doesn't require any identifiers. So you can anonymize data sets so that you have students' information, but you can't track that student per se. That is, we know that the student was, we know a student was in 3rd grade and got such and such scores on their tests and later failed out of college or something like that. I mean, but we won't know who that student is. You need to have a certain connection if you're going to physically connect records initially. So transcripts are sent with identifiable information, with identifying information. And that's another kind of component as well. There's a difference between identified data and identifiable data. And FERPA speaks to identifiable, and that's why we end up with stars and things, because you can determine from, you know, just a couple of attributes in some cases who a student is or who is likely to be. However, the research in our data systems, we've removed the identifiers on our production database. We don't ever need to know. So if somebody thought we were tracking students, the production data warehouse doesn't have that data in it. And it's not even possible, even through court order. I mean, we could go back and reconnect it through court order, but in the production environment, the records aren't identified.
And the community colleges have something similar to that, and we do get the social security numbers, though, to connect to workforce.
Sure.
And that's another type of research that we do, and we have to do for some of our federal reporting. So, but when we get that, we put an identifiable number on it, similar to ODE, and then the social security numbers don't get used until they have to come out to go to employment for that wage matching.
I want to get back to something after your presentation.
Speak up or move closer.
Sure, sorry about that.
Yeah, we're going to speak up.
You're barely audible.
Okay, thank you. I want to, one of the things that Jan McComb brought up and several other folks brought up early this year was the concern about early learning and what the data from early learning, what might come of that data. So we have two ends of the spectrum there, early learning and the data that you're dealing with at the once you get into post-secondary that we really haven't had a good handle on yet. Those are two concerns that I think we need to speak to as well, because you do have the Social Security numbers in the post-secondary. What do we have in terms of early learning? I don't know right now. But we're collecting data there, so.
And I've added that onto our list.
Yes.
Early learning is just getting off the ground
Right.
in terms of what they're collecting, and I think
Yeah.
that'd be a really interesting presentation on what they're thinking.
So really, this is just some information about the existing security policies and processes that we have. So if there's any interest in looking at any of these in detail, I can provide that. It's really just including that to show that we've got a lot of different policies existing within ODE around security. And same thing at a state level. Cinnamon's kind of mentioned some of these, that there's a variety of state requirements in terms of handling state information and protecting that also apply. And that is it.
Okay. On the security, it was a real surprise to hear Alder somehow has ended up as OEIB's system. I'm not clear when and how that all happened, but will the security be applied to OEIB the same way? I think there's a certain amount, again, of proliferation of this stuff going all over the place, and all of a sudden we find out a major investment program has moved, and now it's in someone else's hands. How does that get?
Yeah, all of
I'd be real curious, and I hope there's a statutory structure that guarantees this stuff is secure.
Right. Yeah, all of the
Very concerned
same.
about it.
All of the same security will apply, and the system is not active. There's not active production data in it. this juncture. Alder doesn't.
Well, it clearly is moving around, and the data must be going, will be
There's no
following
data.
us.
There's no data in it.
No, but at some point there will be, I
Right.
assume, although I watched kids for years and you began to wonder if anything would follow it.
Right.
But clearly, there's data planned to move, and it's understanding what identifiers look like, what the protections look like. These have been real concerns out there. They're the things that have been expressed to me, and the main reason I'm sitting here is making sure that if stuff's moving to OEIB, it is as protected, as secure, using the same kind of identifiers that you use that provide for anonymity. I want to make sure that's just really understood, or do we need statute to protect it? Or do we need to get you into Ways and Means to have the representative take a look at it to make sure this stuff is secure? I've been real concerned about it. I think you're probably aware of it.
Sure, yeah. Again, we've worked very, very closely with ODE. The ODE had planned for a state longitudinal data system, but didn't have governance really to make it happen, to make decisions. This is the same notion that originally fostered Alder thinking, but sitting in a place where the chief education officer has some statutory authority over higher ed and early learning. But all of the IT support and direction, really we're taking our lead from our partners on the higher ed and the ODE side. We have a staff of 2 people at OEIB on a data system. There is no data system. We're working on preparing a case still to the legislature to be funded. It hasn't been funded yet.
Well, it sure sounded like it moved around. And I mean, as it's described, the older system described now as OEIB's system, it sounds
Right.
like a fait accompli, and it's understanding where we are in the, it just sitting here listening to this, it begins to sound like things are happening that really haven't been through the process. And so it,
From where I said I'm optimistic that it would happen, it has not happened yet.
Okay.
And we spend a lot of time on non-identifiable information, identifiers, secure ways to transmit, ways to not make sure that we're providing any legacy to personal information. We're actually waiting for a go or no go and things like that. It hasn't happened yet. I think it's also critical to understand, just for everybody listening, we passed a law saying that we would build a longitudinal database at the OEIB because of a need that was seen. And we have not been able to hit that target yet, but we're actually trying to follow direction from the legislature to create that. And with it comes all those security concerns, but at the same time, we have not accomplished that feat yet. And therefore, every year, we spend $7 billion in the K-12 system with no mechanism to measure the outcomes for those kids when they get to higher ed. And that's another kind of risk that we're not addressing.
And that debate will occur in the next session as they renew your sunset and see what we're talking about here.
Yep.
Okay.
So we're at are there any other additional questions for ODE? So, Cheng Fei, are you ready?
Thank you, Ben.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. And Ben, Angela wants a copy of that so we can get it up on the web.
Encrypted.
Yeah.
Take your BIS.
Yeah, exactly.
So folks, if you're in the audience or if you're on the panel, I want to refer to the conceptual grid of topics. I'll just explain what this grid is. And then we're going to do some discussion among committee members that's going to provide direction for our next meeting. Anybody not able to find the grid on the committee? I could be referring to that. So at our last meeting, we went around in a circle and asked for some more specific language in these different categories that folks who came to the table felt that we needed to address, whether it be in law, administrative rule, or local policies. And as an example, under data use, we talked about sharing, we talked about nonprofits. We had someone come up here from a nonprofit that we talked to. We talked about interagency and those other bullets under data use. Under privacy, we similarly came up with subtopics. So what Cheng Fei did, who's working right now on the computer, do you need a, I'll let you just do that for a sec. What Cheng Fei has done in terms of research is she has cross-referenced every one of these individual topics against federal law, state law, and state administrative rules, and noted where these things are covered or whether it's silent. So as you'll see, someone came to the meeting last time and mentioned data minimization, which is a really interesting concept that personally I'd like to follow through on. When you look at the law, data minimization isn't mentioned. I'm not sure if it's nowhere, I'll have to look on here, but data minimization doesn't come up in the old laws. So it's scored like a 0. Whereas some of these other ones came up with a higher rating. Not a higher rating, but a higher number of mentions. So what we're going to see on this spreadsheet is, for each of these topics, how much coverage is there already and where does it exist? And then we're going to have a discussion about our thoughts on whether or not staff should work on expanding language, finding language, addressing that topic. And actually Cheng Fei's got a way to actually note how many votes there were, just to see the feeling of the committee. It's not a binding vote. It just gives us a sense if nobody on the committee thinks we should look at data minimization, that gives us some direction as a staff. And what we would come back at the next meeting would be with is the next step of law, policy, or rules in that area. The other thing I want to mention that's not in your printed packet, but that is on the web, and I have the one hard copy in the room, but you guys can look at it, is Cheng Fei has researched every single state's existing laws and rules on this, and it's this big. There's a lot. So there's a lot for us to look at so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's also federal legislation that's been proposed, and that has been printed out for you on the table. So our intent is not to rewrite, and I'm not sure Representative Frederick ultimately is going to be the person doing this, not us. But in terms of suggestions, our intent is not to reinvent the wheel. Our intent, at least first, would be to look at, well, what are other states doing on some of these issues? And especially states that are a lot like Oregon. One thing Chuck was talking about before was, well, it looks like we're all over the place in Oregon. We've got lots of different data flying around out there. It's kind of an Oregonian thing that we've got a lot of local control. There are other states that are way more central control type states, and I referenced Massachusetts. If we look at a state to emulate, it's much more likely we're going to find answers in Colorado or Idaho than Massachusetts as a first cut. That's not to say that we wouldn't learn something from another state, like Massachusetts or Maryland, but it's more likely we'll find it in other places. So if folks in the audience or online are interested, this state by state is prepared. I'm not sure that that's going to be valuable today, but it might be valuable in the interim as you look at some of these states or have some ideas about where we can find some really, really good language. The last thing I'll just mention is the federal legislation that's out has been critiqued by some different groups. And it's going to be no surprise to those of you who studied this. There are groups that have looked at the federal legislation and said it's not strong enough. It doesn't deal with X, Y, or Z. And there's other groups that we've looked at that said it doesn't do anything. It's too strong. There's groups that say it's not strong enough, and there's groups that say it's too strong. It would prevent us from doing X, Y, and Z. So there's no magic bullet waiting for us in Washington that perfectly weaves around all of these issues and settles them. And who knows if it would even get passed. I don't. and there may be others in the audience who know more than I do about it. I know Lori has been doing some research through the National Education Association about their understanding of it. It's possible others of you who represent private or public organizations know more than I do about the federal prospects. But I think there's things we can learn about it. It's in there. Data minimization is referenced in the federal law. But I looked on one parent website, and the feeling was it didn't go far enough. I think that's right, Cheng Fei. So it's good for us to refer to, but nothing's been settled given the federal law. So before we start on the spreadsheet and we talk about these individually, I just want to see if there's questions on the committee about what I just said about the state stuff or anything that we've provided so far in our report, which has now grown from 19 pages to about 70 pages, something like that. Any questions about that? Or okay, so again, apologies to the folks far back, and there's no reason you can't slide your chairs closer. We have on the top of this spreadsheet, we start with data use, and the first subcategory is data sharing. And what we're hoping to do, and this was provided to you, by the way, Cheng Fei's provided how many laws, rules address that. What we'd like to do is have a discussion and see from the committee how many people feel in this area, based on what you know today, how many of you feel that this is one we need to look at addressing in law, in statute, or helping guide localities with respect to their policies? Yes, absolutely, Cheng Fei,
So
please do.
when I was creating this matrix, disclaimer, I'm not an expert in interpreting laws, so I'm hoping to get some guidance from folks here who have that expertise. So if you see that things that are not correctly labeled or it's missing, please let me know. So I did my best to interpret all these federal laws, Oregon revised statutes, Oregon administrative rules, and supporting policies that are in place by DARF and ODE. And so what I created is this matrix where the first section, these are all federal laws, and then followed by N. Okay, so at the end of each section, I have a total, which means the total number of federal laws I found. And then I computed a coverage of how, for each column, these federal laws have some elements in it that cover data use, and then specifically related to data use, data sharing, nonprofit, interagency, LEA, et cetera, as the column goes on, and then the percentage of that. And then the same thing goes for the ORS. I have 6 of them, and then OAR, I have 2. And then here are supporting policies and plans that are put in place by DAS and ODE. And so in the end, I basically added all of them just to give like a big picture of how much coverage we have overall and the percentage of that. And so today, as part of our activity, I think we're gonna try to get some idea of like, okay, who thinks that this needs, more work done, and then I'll tell you that to see where everyone feel like this is an area we need to really work on.
Peter, excuse me, Jim Craven. You said this is available somehow on the website?
Yeah, Angela, do you want to
give us an idea of where to look for it?
Okay.
So we actually have a hard time hosting Excel sheets on the website, but
Right.
instead what's posted is my email address, and if you'd like a copy sent to you by email, then you can certainly email me,
You'll
I'll send
send
it.
the entire electronic version of it?
I will send you the Excel sheet, it's a pretty good sized document.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, believe it or not, it's
It's
so
just
big, and for some reason our hosting, we can't even host it. We tried to turn it into a PDF and it like broke.
Yeah.
So there's a shorter version of the spreadsheet, the short tally one that is up there, is that right?
This is the one.
Oh,
This is the one that's telling. The gigantic version, I can show it to you as this. This is huge. I mean, this is not like if I show you the content of some of them.
Makes my head
It's huge. As you can see, it's already dizzying at this time.
So then just for clarity, Angela, if they ask, are they going to get both of these?
What they'll get is the detailed matrix and then the regular matrix.
Okay, so one is labeled detailed, that's the humongous or gigantic one. And again, I just want to note and thank Cheng Fei for all this work. This is a huge resource to have available, and the organization of it's great. So questions before we kind of start to go through these and get a sense from committee about these? Oh, sorry.
I have reviewed Appendix 5, which is the legislation and practices in other states. And I'm seeing some good language in contracting laws in other states where there might be potential for modifying Oregon's public contracting laws. So can you point me to where in this discussion that might be addressed? Would that be data? Which
I
one
think
of
that'd
those?
be data use, data sharing.
Okay.
Do you think that that's where contracting would be? Contracting out with vendors or the cloud?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps we can expand this section to not just nonprofit, interagency, LEA, SEA, maybe contractors.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And again, everything that gets said at this is recorded. We do listen to them afterwards. We did at the last meeting flesh out some of these as a result of listening, so we'll make sure to include that. Did you note, just while you're at it, states that had stuff that you liked at the time you were looking?
I don't have
Okay.
her level of patience.
Okay. Okay, so the first topic is data use and data sharing, which is what Betty introduced there. It has to do with sharing with a variety of different groups. So we're going to do questions and Cheng Fei, do you need a number for a denominator here?
I have the 13 total panel members
Right, okay,
now.
perfect. So questions about data use, data sharing, what that means. Pretty straightforward one. I show of hands folks who are interested in having that be something that we research forward on language.
You asked if it's perfectly clear, but no.
Okay.
It's never perfectly clear.
So it's really a catch-all. I think that, as you'll see, involves a lot of different usage, both through some of the more approved agencies that we consider approved, all the way up to and including vendors. And so I think there's a huge spectrum there. Is that right, Cheng Fei? Please stop me if I say the wrong thing.
Oh, no.
So I think it's very broad. How is educational data shared?
How or what is
How or
shared?
who? Yeah.
How, what, and who?
So and I apologize, I wasn't at the last meeting, so I'm catching up a little bit, and I apologize if you
It's okay.
discussed it. But when you talk about that, are you really talking about that at the organizational level, how the organizations and agencies share, or does that extend down to, let's take it all the way to the classroom, where a teacher has downloaded an app and is putting assessment data in a vendor that is not known. So where's the boundary in terms of data sharing?
I'll let a number of other folks take a stab at that.
I think that's the whole range. We're not talking about.
Not just organizational, but
all the way.
data sharing independent of level and level of detail.
Exactly, and the middle part of, if it's going into a cloud at the school level, whatever, and then who has connection, who has contact, who has information there. One of the things that has been brought up in a couple of situations is the concern that if a company goes out of business that is now, that you're being used as a vendor, is that information part of their sale? And if that's the case, then who gets it?
Right. Okay, thank you. That helps.
And now as I look at these bullets, you'll notice that we get some more specificity on some of these other bullets that are also around use. So second one was nonprofit. This was not on our radar until the last meeting. and we had, that came up, and there was some questions about the use of data by nonprofits.
Right.
And, you know, I don't know to what degree that is even something that's regulated by educational agencies. You know, for instance, Boys and Girls Club, or any, you know, the swimming pool, you know, kids come and sign up for activities there, and that isn't really within the purview necessarily of the ODE or the school district or the ESD or the university. But if you folks will recall who was here, what the nonprofit agency was saying is we do tutoring, and we'd really like to know if our math tutoring resulted in higher grades. And I think for a number of us that piqued our interest. Well, is that going on already? So that's why that's on the list.
Well, there was more to it too. They based a lot of their grant applications on the data that they got regarding how well their tutoring was doing, and that was based around who they were identified to tutor, and that was being identified by schools and programs. So they were being certain kids were being suggested to go into those tutoring programs. I think it's a very interesting area. I don't know if anybody else has dealt with it. Did you see any other states that had anything dealing with that kind of an issue, the nonprofits?
I don't know. I have to look into it.
I don't recall hearing anything like that. I thought it was a really new concern.
Would it come up on your scoring sheet? No, because nonprofit was a subcategory.
Well, it was lumped into LEAs, SEAs.
Okay.
There's also draft legislation, I don't know if it's from OEIB or who it's from, but suggesting almost mandatory activity between school districts and others dealing in education and nonprofits. Referenced as community organizations, I assume nonprofits. And I think at the point you are at least looking at that and it becomes a policy argument, we ought to be dealing with it in this area too. If you're particularly, if OEIB believes it will be developing longitudinal data from these kinds of interactions between nonprofits and educational groups.
And I think you're referencing, I know the Oregon Department of Education has a proposal for kids going into kindergarten to get tutoring and other summer school services for kids who are behind in reading, so they come ready to learn in kindergarten. So that's...
Well, it's even more complex than that, the stuff that I saw. So I think it's a really good idea as long as you're dealing with it in any way, requiring that kind of interaction with really making sure that data is safe.
Any other questions or discussion around the table? And we'll do the same. I'm wondering if we're going to get 13 hands on every single one of these. Yeah.
Well, I had some of these are subsets of data sharing.
Right. That's what I was noticing, yeah.
Yeah, I wondered if that wouldn't be covered.
But there's also ways to respond to folks where you don't actually have to share identifiable data both ways. So that the folks doing tutoring could identify with an SSID that has been provided to them which students and other data, if they need to have program A, program B, that they offer the student. And you can generate a single report back to them.
Right.
That says 67% of the folks went up 1.0 grade point at least, or however. You don't have to give them individual names and performance back. So it's
That's a great point.
But it's something that's not clear right now. We need to make it more clear.
So nonprofit, show of hands, that we should be looking into that.
So Peter, just clarification of the
Yes.
question. So the question is not whether we think nonprofits should get information from ODE,
Right.
whether you need to research
Right.
that question?
It's the question number 2, should we research? And as per what Bob just said, and then Rep. Frederick responded, in that case, maybe it's direction to districts about a method to work with a community nonprofit that preserves the identifiable nature of the data that allows their partnership to occur. Might be technical assistance or suggestions versus a law.
practice.
Or a rule, it's a practice. So by voting, you're actually saying to Chen Fei and our team, this is one we want to, when we come back, we're gonna wanna see some language or some suggestions around whether it's law, policy, or
To allow it to happen.
or to allow it to happen safely, or, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't
So,
think we're at that level yet. Yes.
so, not coming from the educational world, my confusion is having them all broken down. To me, anybody outside of the organization is a third party.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that's kind of like acceptable use of
Yes.
sharing with a third party, not necessarily, regardless of what their function is.
I agree.
The parameters, I guess, with any third party
Right.
is kind of where,
Right.
So
Are we gonna
don't
break it
split
down
out
for each?
nonprofit, just third party.
I don't think it matters
Right.
whether they're nonprofit or for-profit. I
Right.
think it's based on business need and those requirements. But that's just my perspective.
Let me check perception on that topic. That certainly narrows the work a little bit.
Mhm.
Any dissent that nonprofits should have a special status with respect to rules around data use, or they're the same as a for-profit?
If there is a statutory requirement, or if OEIB sees this as, or anyone else as one of the improvements on educational service delivery, and you're going to be measuring outcomes, they're going to be collecting data, I would assume, of their own. It's not just a sharing, they're also collecting in order to prove that there's
Right.
some sort of valuable investment.
Right.
So wouldn't there be some governance requirement around their data collection of students that are put into their hands as a function of the statutes? I don't know. I mean, I really don't, but it does make me wonder a bit.
So if I could hold that, that's a great question, but are we going to distinguish between for-profit and nonprofit? Is there any difference? If they're not an educational institution, they're just other, some other? Because an organization could go from profit to nonprofit over the summer.
Right.
And would the rules change all of a sudden?
I don't know why you would change privacy and security rules around it based on that.
Can I jump in here? This is Becky Strauss with ACLU. Sorry to have joined so late. I had some confusion with the number.
That's okay, Becky. We had, AT&T lost our service, so we had to change our number.
Great. Well, glad I was able to plug in. Just on this topic, I think if I could maybe restate what I'm hearing, lots of entities collect personal private information about lots of different things. And so it seems that the question for the work group, what is the scope? Are we only looking at what happens when public entities or somehow public funded entities, which may be two different things, are collecting data, and where does that data go? Or are we looking at a broader brush of all types of entities that might collect student-related data, and what can those entities do? It seems a simpler task to look at the former,
Right.
and include within any third-party sharing, regardless of your tax status. There should be guidelines around what the public entity does with that information vis-a-vis third parties. But then there could be that broader scope where we say, what if the nonprofit is collecting student private information? What does that nonprofit do with the information?
And when you
what
said-
does the third party do with the information? It seems like it might be cleaner for this work group and more manageable to stick with the former, but I don't have a sense of the scope of that collection outside of that nucleus, that narrower scope.
And when you say the former, that was public or publicly funded, and that
I
goes to,
believe so.
that goes to
Yeah,
Chuck's
we can define
question.
that differently, but
So
seems to
I'm
be
going
the
to
primary
propose,
purpose of what this work group is looking at.
I'm going to propose that this is about public and publicly funded groups. Because if we go beyond that, the scope is crept to every group that collects student information. Then we're at Boy Scout sign up and Boys and Girls Club and the swimming pool that collects your address. So I don't know what you think, Rep. Frederick.
Well, if the Boy Scouts are getting the information from the public schools,
right,
and they have been at times, then that's a concern. They would be uncovered under this. If we are trying to we're trying to say that the Foot Locker at the mall is taking down names of kids because they're on different track teams That's a different thing altogether.
But if they're getting the data from
From
the
the school.
district, it's
Right.
covered.
It's a different thing.
Right,
But
right.
if they're just
Public
collecting it themselves and
Right.
saying, you know, you're on the track team, and
Right.
that's a different thing altogether.
Right.
Does that work for the group? It's public or publicly funded?
I think that's all that we have real
Yes.
jurisdiction over, quite frankly.
Well, the feds don't agree with that.
Yeah, I know, but that's another story.
Well, there are not-for-profit educational institutions in our state.
Yes.
And they're subject to the same regulations that we are.
That's true, that's true. Well,
But the disposition of publicly funded data, I think, is inappropriate.
you know, I think it's another path to deal with. I would like to be able to do something that I can have an impact on right now. And that would be the publicly funded state institutions and the data coming out of that. I don't have a problem with starting to take on the other side, but let's see what we can do right now.
So can we do it, I don't know if we need a show of hands, shake that, would anybody disagree that we need to be looking at publicly funded organizations as well as just the public organization? So show of hands for a no. Now raising your hand means no, we don't. Actually, turn around. Raise your hand if you agree.
Raise your hand if you're confused.
Raise your hand if you agree. Sorry, I'll just forget
I
that.
agree.
If you agree that this should be, if it's a publicly funded, like Chuck was talking about, a summer school program that's receiving state funding to help kids and they're receiving that data, that they need to be covered under this. Publicly funded, nonprofit or
was
profit.
your-
get a grant from the feds, and that
Or from the state.
the state.
Like we right now give grants to organizations throughout the state to do STEM, I know that. We're doing that right now, and I don't know what the rules are around the data they're collecting, to be honest with you. So show of hands for public or publicly funded data use, data sharing. Right, that's almost all. And honestly, if we have just a few votes, we're gonna research
Put
it.
it in a half there.
Okay. So that's a yes. 12 or,
I think it was 11.
you know, Chuck checked out and he'll be back and he brought the whole idea up, so.
Guilty by absence.
So Cheng Fei, the next one on your sheet says tied to funding.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian. And that's, what can you, is that just, what is that?
I think during our discussion, it was about, it was related to what we just discussed, anything that's related to a funding by the federal level initially. Yeah.
Okay.
But, so it looks like we can collapse these two.
Okay. And the other bullets on the handout are really that we just had split out LEAs, SEAs, so that's sort of covered. So now we're on to data privacy. And we did have a testimony at the last meeting on this notion of data minimization. And I was ignorant of that term when it was brought. Personally, I've now read about it, really interesting. It is mentioned in the federal law. And now we can have a discussion about it. If folks have questions about what it is, we can discuss it. And then we're going to ask, should that be something we look at including language about data minimization? So questions about that? Folks recall the discussion?
Is that about collecting the least amount of data as possible to
Yeah.
get the impact or the outcome?
Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more like a guiding principle when we
Yeah.
think how laws are going to, how situations going to change every day. What are some guiding principles?
So
maybe?
does that kind of go back to the privacy principles that are already kind of established within standards? I mean, privacy principles based on minimum data, control of access. I mean, there's a whole standards already set on privacy principles.
Do you know, did that come up when you were, did it get some scores on places where it was covered? It looks like it's 5% covered. So according to our analysis, it's lightly covered.
It is, but I think it's a new term in the fact that it's always been a concept, but it's now just kind of, there really are baked privacy principles out there. I think I forget 7 or 12 of them about privacy specific. And so that may be something to look at.
Are you saying that there are rules out there, but?
It's kind of an industry kind of standard privacy principles. They
Because
are
it-
established by OCG, I believe.
Well, I'm just trying to understand why it's become such a problem if it's a standard that's supposed to be in place.
I think it's coming up with what is the minimum necessary. It's not so that everyone agrees that you need to, not collect extra data, but is agreeing on what the core data is that should be collected. It's kind of like scope creep. They always, it's like, well, if we have the data, then you can do this. Well, that's not what it was gathered for to begin with. And so if you're gathering data for one action, that's what that should be used for, and not for subsequent one-offs, is what that's all about, without the user's permission. If you go back to them and they agree to it, that's a different discussion.
So there's some existing
Privacy
related
principles.
privacy principles.
Yep.
Other questions on data minimization, just what it is, so that we can get a sense of folks who think we should research it further?
Well, as
Elizabeth?
long as this isn't something that's going to say, you can only collect this data, that's it. And you can only use it for this, that's it. Because when we look at research or evaluation, sometimes you will unearth something that needs further examination. And so then do we have to come back to the legislature and ask for permission to collect more data or to use it in a different way?
Or even go back to the source again.
Right.
Well, and I think that's the key about that is that when you're going to collect data, to be very clear about what you're collecting the data for, and making sure that the people who are providing you that information knows what you're going to use it for. If that scope changes, then you do have to ask them again.
And we kind of operate under that already.
Most do. Research is really...
Research is a real broad category.
Right.
In all our disclosure statements, we include research as one of the uses.
Absolutely. Right.
But you definitely are getting into some maybe yes, maybe no kinds of areas.
Right.
I'll just throw one out there as financial aid.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they give them a lot of information so that they can qualify for federal financial aid programs. And right now, probably the biggest post-secondary issue is accessibility, is affordability. How can these students afford to go? Well, if you don't know anything about financial status of the students, then you can't really draw a lot of conclusions about that. They don't provide it to us to determine whether the right people are getting access to university or college. But
that's what's being asked of us.
I mean, because if we fail, we failed our students.
So there'd be some parameters, obviously, around this that'd be really interesting to look at, what it actually says. Other thoughts about data minimization, what it means, questions about it?
I'd have to know a lot more about it, Peter, before I'm willing to say yes. I just have a discomfort about it.
And just to be clear, go ahead, Chengfei.
Oh, I was going to ask if I'll probably connect with Simon and get those principles.
Yep, I can send those to you. I have the link to them.
Thank you.
Just to be clear, this is not a vote on, I think we need to have a law about data minimization. It's to help us prioritize our next level of work, to see if this is something we should investigate. Did Ohio pass it? What is in the federal law about data minimization?
Okay.
And we might have at our next meeting, 4 options, or 6, or 2. And then we could really say, what would the ramifications of that be? But some of these, hopefully, people are going to say, nah, don't do it.
Right. We haven't
Not
gotten
so
there
far.
yet. Yeah.
So,
Not so much.
Never know. So, show of hands on data minimization, a topic we should pursue further.
Peter,
1, 2,
we might have members online too that you might want to take verbal votes from.
Okay. So if you're a member of the work group, when we ask for votes here, and it's anywhere close, we're going to ask for you to weigh in. So members present, raise your hands if you want data minimization. I already see almost everyone, so if you're if you're on the phone, just know that almost everyone raised their hand on data minimization. Chinve, I think I counted 11 of 13, so that's obviously one we'll do more on. Okay, parent access. What was that? Chinve, generally?
It was about parents having the ability to have records for students, I think, which I think FERPA currently have some coverage, but maybe not enough. I'm not sure. Oh,
Well,
I have 0 there.
There is, as you said, there's language. It is not necessarily passed along to parents. And I think we had testimony last time. Was it you, Chris, who testified about getting your records and?
Well, and I will speak more to this with a very specific comment on special ed kids later on. But yeah, there's that issue of parental access to data is incredibly important, especially when we're talking about third-party vendors who are going to be putting sensitive data in the clouds. And I will give you a specific example to address that.
But that's a particular concern of mine. And it's also part of a number of the proposed parent-student privacy rights legislation that's being put out there. So I think that it's something we really need to look at.
So parent access to data that SEAs are holding on their children. Other questions, thoughts?
Well, are we talking parent access on SEAs? I thought it was both state level and local level.
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
LEAs and SEAs. And I think LEAs is probably the bigger issue.
Yeah.
Does that include students who are past the age of 18 then?
Well, that's another question, how long that access is available.
Well, or if a student who turns 18 then has the ability to access, and if parents still have access.
The parents don't necessarily have access.
Right.
No,
No.
not
It's really in the medical world.
Right, right.
Like what they're doing 14.
Yeah.
It's that way for us.
Seems to be a little more flexible. Maybe it's not the law, but it seems a little more flexible.
We have parents call all the
Yep.
time who ask how their
Yep.
students are doing, and they say, what student?
Yeah.
That's exactly.
At a high school, you'll get a different response. Is my observation. So again, any other questions about parent access? And again, just a show of hands of folks who think that that should be something that we research further. 6, 7. Anyone on the line want to weigh in on parent access? Who's on the committee? We're on the work committee, work group? Okay, sounds like another one we're going to do, certainly more than half of us. Opt-in or opt-out? Currently, for a lot of the things that we talked about for directory information, parents opt out. And opt-in is this other notion that you have to affirm any use of data. I don't know if other folks want to say more about the opt-in, opt-out.
The opt-in is probably covered under the privacy principles. And that's their preferred methodology, is that you opt in, not opt out.
And just being a voice from the field, we're going to hear it from schools.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, I agree.
The paperwork involved in opt-in is just incredible.
Yep.
The few places where we do it, it almost actually causes you to not collect anything, and maybe that's what some folks would want. But even just getting
agree.
the photos done.
But I think there's a lot of people who don't know they have the right to opt out of certain things.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's the balance. And so it's just a matter of, you know, maybe it's an educational thing.
I should say, there's just a belief that they're supposed to just go along with no matter what's being said by an authority figure.
And some won't opt out because of that.
Real concern.
Right. I saw some hands, Bob and then Steve.
I just wondered about the scope of what you're talking about. Because
Yeah.
a lot of things are clearly identified in law. Purpose is.
Correct.
Boy.
It's directory information, I think, is the key thing.
Well, you can't really change that. Students have the right to privacy.
Well, I guess in my mind, I voted for it, not so much so we talk more about the law, but how are we going to get the education out? Because I think that's, for both opt-in and opt-out and parental rights, I think that's the big problem that we've talked about.
Right.
It's not so much the legal standpoint, it's the how do we make sure parents are informed, know their rights, know what they can and can do.
I think it's a little clearer at the university level, though, because we're generally dealing with adults.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I just want to follow up on something that Ben just said there, because it really helps direct our research a little bit, or our thinking a little bit. Is there agreement that something like the opt-in, opt-out is really a communication issue on rights? Or are there strong thoughts that there's laws or regulations that should be in place that aren't? And I'll just stop. I'm not sure what people are thinking.
well, it sounds like it's a communication thing, what people have been saying, but
So for me, it seems like what we need to have is a policy discussion on all these points. I don't know how much research we would need, because I think some of these issues seem kind of clear cut, and it depends on what's right for Oregon. And in the topic of opting in and opting out, it seems like we could have a discussion of what are the pros of opting in, what are the cons, and do the pros outbalance the cons, and that would be a policy decision. It's always interesting to know what kind of work is done, but they might have a little different culture there than Oregon. And really, I think just knowing what the pros and cons of these are, and the costs and benefits, would maybe help propel the discussion faster.
I appreciate that.
Becky,
I
with
worry about
you,
your
I would
research
agree
is
with
kind
that,
of
and then just also say if there, on the research side of things, if there are differences between what is, shall I say, mandatory collection, or things that someone really couldn't opt out of, maybe that's a different discussion, but if there are things beyond that, that an opt-in, opt-out policy discussion is warranted, maybe we could have some distinction between those two buckets.
I missed the very beginning of that. Did you catch it, Cheng Fei?
I think she was
What's
agreeing-
mandatory collection?
Oh, for,
Yeah, I guess I'm just making the comment that if it's legally not an option to be opting out of the data collection, then the opt-in, opt-out policy discussion is moot. But in the case that it is relevant, I think it's a very important discussion to have.
Thank you.
And there are gray areas where you can be required to provide information for a certain purpose, but you don't want it used for any other purpose, and financial aid is another.
So just for my clarification too, are we talking about disclosure or are we talking about collection?
yeah.
It's a little different.
Disclosure, yeah.
Yeah. I thought we were talking about disclosure of
Yes.
information, not necessarily collection. Well, I mean, we can talk about both, but just to be clear.
I was thinking disclosure, but
Okay.
I don't know what others were.
both actually.
In disclosure to whom for what reason?
Disclosure to whom for what reason? And just an answer, Jen, in terms of research, I think the research is pretty much done. It's going to be kind of what we're going to pull out, and we were hoping to narrow the scope so the next round could be a little more streamlined, and it might not be. So do we do a show of hands on opt-in, opt-out? It really seems like we need to discuss that. So, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,
8.
so way more than half. Linking to other data sets.
How is that different than data sharing?
It's a good
I
point.
don't know. Was that a separate category? I'll let Cheng Fei do the rating there.
This one?
Yep.
This was, from our last discussion, there were talks about how like data from health-related data, so that would touch into HIPAA or financial aid, which I think you brought up. this was the root for this column. And it, you know, and as I said before, I think this is the main category, data privacy, and these are the subcategories that we think maybe need more clarification. But if today this group thinks that it doesn't need to, then we can just collapse
It's a
them.
subcategory of sharing, perhaps? Is there a difference there? Folks can discern? Chris?
I want to point out, just from the standpoint of health data in particular, schools, you know, the education system in general, they're not a covered entity of HIPAA. And, you know, so therefore, any kind of data that's shared is not protected by the privacy policies of HIPAA. And so it is with recognition that data that is shared, that is brought into the fold of the school systems, are going to be covered by FERPA. So I think it is a valid thing to question this subcategory.
So lots of hands go up to that statement. So another audience member, just for the heck of it? And
FERPA does not cover health records at all. That's in the statute.
Yes.
And at Portland Community College, clinical counseling records, disability service clinical records, those, I'm told by the people who direct those areas, they look to HIPAA, and HIPAA does cover their area.
Yep, school nurses.
Yes.
Yes, and just to clarify, there's a difference after you reach 18, and in particular with mental health records, and because that is quite different when you're starting to talk about who's in control of the data with health records in higher ed. But we're talking about the voluntary contribution of medical records that are often asked of parents to help with special ed. And that is, again, you know, when someone voluntarily gives information and does not understand that HIPAA protections do not apply because schools are not covered entities. I mean, it's one thing when you're talking about billing for Medicare and Medicaid. It's quite another when someone provides medical records to schools. They're not covered by HIPAA.
I think that would need to be investigated because my understanding in education, even K through 12, is that HIPAA does play a role in that. And also, you know, the new HIPAA rules have changed, so it's not just covered entities, that business associates are also now covered under the same. So, I mean, that I think, and I do believe there's already a DOJ opinion on education, K through 12, FERPA and HIPAA, and that actually HIPAA does take precedence over FERPA in medical records. But that's just my, so I think that would be worth.
We need some clarification.
Good follow-up on that.
Yeah.
So especially around special education where that does come up.
Yeah.
Okay. So it sounds like even though that sort of is a sharing thing, it did elicit a great conversation about HIPAA at schools. Data security, a new topic. So we had things listed in here like location. That's where data is stored. And I think Ben referenced earlier that that's actually internally at the state has come up as an issue. And Cheng-Fei, so there's not much law, or you found zero on data location in existing law, or zero.
Let's see.
That doesn't, law I wouldn't think would
Or
cover
anything.
Zero.
Law, administrative rule, or federal, state, or administrative rule.
It depends on which laws you're looking at and what the sensitivity of
sorry.
the data is.
There was some coverage, 10%.
Yeah, there should be.
Those are typically related to ODE, internal laws, and DAS.
Yeah.
There should be some DAS policy about not making agreements with vendors that store it outside the U.S. border, blah, 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 blah. So there should be some.
And
I
those are
think there's
based on
room for more.
sensitivity. Oh, yeah. It's state rules and policies are also, when we're talking to agencies, we're talking, those regulations are written to apply to the CRAB Commission and DHS OED and all these other entities. So they are a minimum standard. But I wouldn't expect to see much in a law or even in OAR because those are really specific details and the environment changes so often that if it's not flexible to change with the times, you're gonna be constantly revisiting those.
So that's a great lead into whether we should be looking at that or whether there's existing coverage that's flexible enough to do that. And I don't know, Cinema, if you want to say more about you seem to know more about this than any of us.
Well, I think it's one of those things that the environment changes so often that you're always behind the curve. And so what I'll say on that is it's a matter of staying in front of the curve, which means you actually have to dedicate resources to understanding the curve and knowing what that is. And I think that goes to what Ben was talking about, a privacy officer, someone like that can do, and also doing the outreach to keep everyone else informed and aware of what's going on. You know, there's definitely pros and cons of different environments, and it's all about risk and who's assessing the risk and accepting or not accepting the risk. As a state, we've kind of changing the model so that it's not individuals assessing risk, is that we're trying to look at it from the whole perspective of the state's risks. So that's why some of the standards are written the way they are. It's a lot different when you get down to covering local and regional and all that, because you're not centralized, so you don't have as much control. So it's really about education and awareness.
Is the location component meant really to address who can see the records? I mean, is
That's 3 down.
That would be access control,
That's
I
the
believe.
third one down.
Well, but anytime you go to a third-party vendor to support your transactional system.
Yeah, usually it's locked down pretty minimal, depending on how it's going,
Well,
how it
I
is.
know that New York, they've changed recently with Bloom about who could physically hold the records.
Yep.
Because they obviously have to be able to see it. They're not
Right.
supposed to look at it a lot. But
And at what
any
level?
system administrator has to see what's on disk.
Yeah, and there's a difference between the data level and the system level. So, and a lot of those are outlined in some of our standards. And again, you know, systems and, you know, people think the cloud is new, and it's not necessarily new, it's just a different platform or software as a service. It's really just called a little bit different. But the environment changes so often, it's just something to stay in front of and keep recommending things.
So the key question for this group, I think, is this a topic that we need to look at? And I'm just going to ask you one more follow-up, maybe Cinnamon, in your opinion, what is the current state in Oregon with respect to these issues? What I heard was we're doing pretty good centrally, but maybe not so good out in individuals. And is that because of a law or because of the supporting policy and plans and education or not?
It's probably the education on it. I think, you know, it's something we just have to, for this group, it would be great to hear what they would need, what would be helpful for education, but as far as setting the hard details on where you can and can't locate and what you should and shouldn't do, it really, that would be a hard one for, I think, this group to come up with those things in research.
So thoughts more, I feel like I'm dominating with
No,
It's all right.
I think that, I think you're right in terms of, it's the access issue for me.
Yep.
And how you might have that. If you have to go, you have to come to Salem to get the information. That's about something that's your child in 3rd grade at Dunaway Elementary School.
Right.
Then that's ridiculous. But if we can look at it and figure, I think the access question is the key there. Location would have been really important probably 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
But now because of the electronic access, that's another thing.
So I'm going to propose to the group, just by show of hands, that really we focus in this data security on the first 3 bullets on access as opposed to location storage. And that be the thing that we really bring back and talk most about. And that we, maybe Cinnamon at some point, we might hear more from Daz about what the existing rules are and partner to get that information out. But so by raising your hand now, you're asking us to focus on the access issue more than whether it's stored in a locked room with 3 locks on it versus 4 locks on it. So, show of hands to focus on access. I see 11. And Chuck's gone, so we're now, our denominator's 12.
Okay.
Regulation around data security, I'll let you get that typed in. Trying to say, regulation on data security, is that something you again found as sort of a DAS thing or a state law thing that's already in place?
COPA, FERPA, and HIPAA should cover that quite a bit.
To a degree, I mean, those are some
Yeah, but
principles, but not.
Right, I mean, but that's what a law does, is say you have to protect it. It's not gonna go into the
Right.
detail of how you have to do that, because it has to be flexible, how you do that, so.
Well, I'm really dying to jump to state breach. This is something Representative Frederick asked a number of times.
Yeah.
Who's accountable, what happens? And I think the answer that we got was nothing happens, I sort of felt like.
For breaches?
Well, I heard, I don't know if you consider it a breach if there's something up on the wall, but that's sort of a breach of security.
So I had a conversation, and I don't know if you want to jump in, that there is possibly pending legislation this next session.
Right, so right now there's Cheryl Hinsford, DOJ, the Identity Theft Protection Act, 646A.600. It applies to states as well as corporations. So there's, from what I've been told in brief conversations with us, there's plans in place for that kind of breach. But as far as FERPA breaches and that kind of thing, 646A.600 can cover FERPA or POPA or any of those.
So what makes something an identity theft?
So basically, there has to be access to the information, and that access has to threaten its security, a reasonable threat to security, and then it has to be unencrypted, personally identifiable information.
And the law actually lays out exactly what that PII is under the Oregon law. The thing to note is that personally identifiable information has a different definition in every regulation. So that one is just consumer, but that's a pretty wide, and it's, it's your driver's license, your passport, and your financial, certain things like that. Not necessarily educational or medical or underneath that one. It does say your name in conjunction with these things, but it also has this really nice caveat that says, even if that's not there, if there's enough information to get your identity, it's covered under that. So it doesn't actually even have to include your name.
It sounds like learning more about what's proposed would be really helpful for this group for the next meeting on.
If there's a change to it, I'd love to know about that.
I want to go back to it. I would like to know whether we've seen any consequences for data breaches coming out of any of the laws that we have and the regulations that we already have in place. As far as, I don't know.
DCBS regulates that, so they would be the one who would have that information, whether they've actually invoked any penalties against.
What's DCBS?
Consumer and Business Services.
Okay.
They're actually the ones.
They've done 3 enforcement actions in the last
3 in the last 7
Yes,
Yeah.
all to do with paper
years.
records.
And that's the same kind of as HIPAA in a lot of ways, that the regulations start out with the regulation, and they're actually doing a huge education and awareness and actually trying to put the carrot in front of them to help them instead of, the stick. You want to encourage good behavior. The negative side of doing the penalty phase on those is that if I'm going to disclose and I'm going to be penalized every time, why would I disclose? So you have to balance. Do you want this information, or do you want them to hide the information? So that's just a balance.
That comes back to Jan's question on a policy issue, balancing that.
And for what it's worth, when someone calls us at the Department of Education with a FERPA violation, we refer them to the U.S. Department of Education, to their complaint process. So we don't track those, but we just send them on.
I'd just be curious to see what happens then.
Yeah.
That's the question.
Do you have any knowledge? Steve, do you have any knowledge of what has happened, or? Okay, so I hear data breach is definitely going to follow up with the DMA proposed law. The last category was data integrity, and that got added, I think, in the research period after our last meeting. And it had to do with verification, validation, and correction of data. And you'll notice in FERPA, that's a right that folks are supposed to have, is to be able to double check what's on the record and be able to correct it. So, just looking at Cheng Fei's, where's integrity? So there was a little bit of coverage of that in which he researched, not a ton. So first off, on validation, actually either one of them together, folks' thoughts about this, whether this is something we should look into more. Is it an issue? Is it fine as it stands?
It's an issue as far as I'm concerned.
Both of those are covered in the privacy principles as well. The right to inspect, the right to know, and the right to correct.
So is there another case where there's
Overlapping.
but maybe the practice is that it's very difficult?
Absolutely.
As we heard from testimony earlier, it can be difficult to get the data, it can be hard to understand it. I know in my school district, getting something changed can be very, very, very difficult. You have to be super perseverant.
Yeah.
You need to give up at some point. So I guess a show of hands that we should bring something back around the idea of validation and correction. They sort of go together hand in glove, really. Nine. So we did actually knock a couple out. We are not going to be tackling some issues about location and storage issues, mainly referring to existing laws and talk about better communication out to the field. There's a final row, and maybe some of this will come up in public comment, but a final row on this other. So this is the universe of our next steps, what we're going to be debating and discussing for our next meeting. Pros and cons, here's different ideas out there. So now's a, not final I guess, but almost penultimate maybe chance to get stuff in front of our research group that we really need to bring forward at our next meeting. So members of the committee, are there things that you were expecting to hear that didn't get brought up that you really do want to have a voice in? Maybe tweets that you've received?
Apparently I'm receiving quite a few. I didn't realize. At this point, I mean, these are the main issues that I've been concerned about, and my goal is to get something, or at least one or two legislative concepts, if nothing else, as placeholders for this session. So we have to have that in by, I think it's September 22nd. So I will be putting at least a few things in there related to some of these ideas. And I've talked with a number of the other legislators about this, and so they're interested. They're very interested, and it is on both sides of the aisle, if you will, for various reasons, but in many cases just for the very same reason, the concern about student privacy and who has what records.
So if I can ask you, Representative Frederick, how do you see a next meeting going? Well, we certainly can bring back info, like I pick on Jan, but you have way more experience than I do at this. Just kind of looking at pros and cons. Would that be helpful? Or
that would be very helpful. I'd like to hear from the electronic privacy folks, because there are several parents that I'd like to. We need to have some parents and some students, if possible, speak to us. I mean, we talked about this at the first meeting, and it would be good to have at least a couple of students, not just college students, but high school students, speak to this.
And now school's in session, I think we can do that.
That's a lot easier, and I know that was one of the major concerns, major problems, especially just before Labor Day.
Those students are
with good reason. But that's what I'd like to see. So those are the primary things. But I'm going to, I really appreciate this. This is incredible, great work. Thank you very much. But I think we need to take the next steps.
Okay. So next thing on our agenda is public comment. If you've not signed up, Angela, where's the sign up sheet?
It's right
for
over there
it?
on the table.
So we'll see who we have on the sheet. And would they just kind of sit next to Steve? Would that be a good spot?
That's fine.
Okay.
Does anybody still need to sign up? Yes.
It's in a nice spot.
You going? Yeah? Are there things that we should do? Okay.
Yes.
So just so folks know, at our last meeting, we set a precedent, which I think is really good, which is we had a little dialogue. If the members of the work group wanted to ask a follow-up question, it was informal enough so that we could do that. I thought that was super valuable. So it might not happen, but if it does, that's totally fine in this slightly less formal process. So Chris Allman.
Are we going someplace?
Right next to Steve at Lori Wimmer's spot. She's not here, so.
Okay. Peter, is there
Yep.
a time limit on the comments?
About 3-ish minutes, but to be honest, we were sort of flexible at the last meeting and it was kind of helpful to go back and forth. So, if it goes on for a while, I might ask you to wrap it up a little bit. And Chris, speak pretty loudly so the folks on the phone can hear you.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay. Chris Allman, for the record. First of all, I really, really appreciate this rich discussion that we have. I've been in the weeds looking at this issue for 3 years now, and it's felt very lonely. So now I feel like I have people I can talk to about this issue, so I'm grateful for it. I want to start out with my comments with a recommendation. The International Review of Information Ethics has a journal, online journal, that you can access for free in July 2014. Their whole issue was on the digital future of education. And one chapter in particular I think is incredibly important to read, the student privacy, harm, and context. And I will take you to just an excerpt that kind of refers to some comments that Lou Frederick made. There was this question of harms that could be relative to discipline records. So anyhow, there's personalized learning is a concept that we're all kind of grasping with. We have not defined. I believe it needs to be defined. But here's what it says. Personalized learning techniques raise these risks of data discrimination in education. The algorithms used to select at-risk students might be proxies for protected classes so that they reinforce historical patterns of discrimination. That's just one of many sentences that raise red flags, and I hope you read this issue. I think it's important. I also want to call attention to Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize on Information Asymmetry. And that takes into account this whole idea of, okay, so are we a 21st century knowledge economy, which is looking at strictly how commerce will profit from what we can do with knowledge, i.e. data, information, Or are we a knowledge society, which is about how we raise all of us to a higher level, to be better citizens, to figure out how to collaborate and to work together to solve the problems of the world? The whole concept of what we're doing with data that puts us into this real problem of information asymmetry. One example that I could bring to mind is Google Apps for Education. Oregon was the first state to make this available. Now, free, right? Well, is there such thing as free lunch? And you may know that this all came to a head. There was a lawsuit in higher education saying that, hey, we don't like this. But apparently it was thrown out because these students did not have standing. But it raises a question, because if we as people, as parents of kids who have access to Google Apps for Education, don't understand the policies that are underwriting this, and Jan knows that I've gotten lots of public records requests through the Department of Ed. If we don't know what's happening, what their policies say about what they could do with the data, where they could store it, on and on, how they can mine it, then how can we even ask those questions about what it's all about or whether to opt out of it? So the other thing that is brought up is, what are other states doing? And Colorado was brought up. That gets into this question of, is data, is it speech, or is it property, or both? And so Colorado, my family lives in Colorado, and so I happen to be following what's going on in Colorado closely. They had this past session actually added to, and we don't have it in Oregon here, they have a constitutional amendment, state constitutional amendment to privacy. And what they wanted to add to their constitutional amendment was e-data. It passed one chamber, it had bipartisan support, but it failed in the second chamber. However, the state of Missouri just passed a law, just passed a law. And that is getting at this idea of the Fourth Amendment, which would be more like, well, data is property. So when we talk about big data breaches, well, we can look at the healthcare sectors and know that there have been horrible data breaches. One of the most recent ones, which I don't think probably any of you know about because I haven't seen it in the media, but it has affected people in the state, is related to the heartbleed virus that went through, and the company that was involved is a for-profit hospital chain here in one hospital in Oregon that was impacted. And so the point is, 500,000 records are impacted. And you brought up, rightfully so, it's the business associate agreements that are the weak link here, because they get all this huge data. And, and in this case too, it wasn't so much medical data, but it was information about the individual that puts them at high risk for identity theft. And some of the biggest data breaches, most of the biggest data breaches in healthcare have been related to the business associate agreements. One affecting, in Utah, a huge one, that is very, very costly that they're still dealing with. Not only do they have to beef up their security. Okay, but I do want to, please indulge me on this one. I do want to bring to the intersection of HIPAA and FERPA. And this is maybe you can help me understand this, but there are various ways that psychologists in the community and within schools use metrics to score for various things, psychological counseling. So I have found out that Pearson has tons of tests that they do, ranging on autism, behavior, memory, neuropsychology, and that the trend is now to do all the scoring online. with their company that they have that's cloud-based. And, you know, it's not as though the parents, I'm sure, would know that that is the case, that they are doing this with the data, because I'm sure that doesn't come up. My son was on an IEP. That obviously was not the kind of ways that data was being put into place in records. But I'm assuming that is going to be the trend, because it would be much easier to score that way and then upload into data systems, because in their ways of saying why they might be an authorized representative, which is related to their capacity to get this data without consent, is that they try to link it to RTI, response to intervention. So when you've got a big corporation like Pearson potentially getting this data, and we haven't made, I don't know what's going on in districts, I don't know if we have policies regarding that, but there's also with free lunches, the same thing. Heartland is a company that is out there, a for-profit company that's going to be the intermediary in some states of getting the money for kids who are going to get their free lunches and tracking all this information. Fortunately, as I got on their website earlier today, Oregon is not one of them, but it makes it so much easier because it's free to use these services. So I guess that's all my comments I want to make. I really share what Chuck Bennett's worries are about what we're doing with these third parties, these business associate agreements, and how that puts us at risk, because we don't know what's happening at the school level to know what to do, what to advocate for, what to opt out of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jody Potter?
Hi, I'm Jody Potter from Portland Community College, and I just wanted to say a few words about dual credit students, because we have like 3 flavors of them. So we have dual credit students who take their courses in the high schools with certified teachers and they get college credit. We also have the Beaverton Early College program that has students that actually take their courses on our campuses, but they're also getting high school graduation credit. And then we have yet another flavor of students who are taking dual credit classes in the classroom at their high school and at the same time taking some of their classes on our campuses. So I just wanted to bring it to your attention that whatever rules and regulations you come up with might impact the community college and how we do business and deal with privacy with our other students, the regular students. So I think there could be some crossover and it might somehow inadvertently bind us in a particular way. So I just want
Let me add to your list, because what you're going to see is there's a report that should be coming out, may have already come out, on accelerated learning plans for the state. And they speak to these dual credit issues with community colleges and colleges. And so you might take a look at that. In terms of the data from that, that's something you do need to take a look at. But it is, I'm on that particular committee as well. So you'll see something. I think it was actually published. It's on OEIB.
It's on OEIB's
yeah,
website.
It's on the website right now.
And the committee is very supportive of increasing those opportunities for students and making it more equitable.
Right.
But we haven't talked about the data.
Statewide, but the data is an issue we haven't talked about.
Right, and our enrollment for high school students is going exponential right now. So trying to make sure that we're protecting them as well as being able to do business the way we need to do business is, I think, is going to be a challenge.
Well, we're talking about at least 9 credit hours, encouraging at least 9 credit hours.
Right.
Yeah, we have high school students actually earning degrees, which is awesome.
Wow, great.
Yeah.
If you go to the Dalles, I will never forget going there, showing up on a Saturday, and finding that the high school graduation had been that Friday night, and there were kids who came walking across on Saturday at the community college graduation as well.
It's a good
Same kids.
Good. Thank you very much. And finally, Bill Fitzgerald.
Hey, just really enjoyed the meeting, enjoyed the conversation.
Say your name again.
Oh,
You're supposed to say it.
I thought you already covered.
Yeah.
My name is Bill Fitzgerald, and I'm a parent of a student in PBS. But one of the things that has been, there's a lot of discussion about what's covered under FERPA, what's covered under COPA, where HIPAA might kick in. PPRA was left out of this, but one of the things that was also left out was the gap between vendors' terms of service and what's covered under FERPA, HIPAA, actually really FERPA and COPA. And that's an enormous gray area that's not getting any attention here. And some of this is actually just flat out a staffing issue at the district level. And one of the ways to address this would actually be to fund districts to actually vet terms of service accurately. It's very time consuming, they're all different. But there are some patterns they could, that could actually be used across these terms of service. One of the things you brought up was how an organization treats student data. Most of the time, these terms of service explicitly reserve the right to sell student data if they are acquired or if they go out of business. There was a recent thing where the FTC stepped in with an organization called Connect EDU that had about 20 million records of people who were going to college. They've been in business for about, I think, 15, 20 years. This is going to be happening more and more because one of the things that we always see within startups is, again, they like to fail fast, and they are. And they're failing with kids' data intact. And as that becomes an asset and we see more recombination, that's something that is, if we limit ourselves to what's covered under FERPA and COPA, this is all going to get left out. So I hope as these conversations move forward that this is also something that gets attention and gets addressed.
In my mind, this is, and I think you're right, at a local level it needs to be addressed, but when I say, I recommend a chief privacy officer, not just one person, but a staff.
Yeah.
This is one of those issues to provide some central review and recommendation to districts.
Well, and actually that recommendation matrix exists. There's a study by Joel Reidenberg out of Fordham at CLIP. Appendix A of that study is the matrix that he used to evaluate a variety of services. And it really is a checklist that highlights the federal law, where it applies, what type of data it covers, that could actually be made into a training that ODE gave to districts or that even ODE gave to ESDs and ESDs gave to districts. So there's a lot of stuff that we're actually talking about in this room that's actually already been done elsewhere. There's a lot of reinventing of the wheel that I hear going on here, whereas I think if we actually went outside and looked at some other things that were happening, our work would be a lot easier. Another example of this was actually the breakdown of privacy laws. Like the Data Quality Campaign has been tracking this since like last April, and they put out a list today, literally of 110 different privacy laws covered that are basically been kind of put forward in various legislatures over the last, I think, 12 to 18 months. So all of these things, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we're doing here that's also being replicated elsewhere. I think it'd be awesome to see us looking and using and incorporating what these other folks are doing.
Probably, if it didn't come up at your last meeting, one resource that's connected to that's Consortium of School Networking just released a student data privacy toolkit, which speaks to how K-12 specifically work with vendors in this space. They actually had Harvard Law produce it, and so it's a great resource.
Right. The unfortunate irony of that was that they actually didn't have a privacy policy covering where you put your information in. So you actually were going after a privacy policy, a privacy white paper that had no privacy policy covering how they were
more connected to I think they were more connected to best practices. Around engagement.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm going to be I'm going to keep bringing this up because, so this is a topic that's great and it's a landscape that's obviously going to keep evolving, right? Which is why, I'm really a big proponent of having some dedicated privacy staff. And I worry about those districts. I'm not worried about Beaverton because Steve's awesome. I'm worried about our small districts, those districts that just do not have the staff to do anything. So we need to have a real intentional reach to those folks.
And also, who's vetting the privacy policies of every app that a teacher and iPad program downloads?
Oh yeah.
That is not happening. And as soon as that happens, there is a doorway to student information going out to a vendor who may or may not be ethical enough to be bound by the privacy policy they agree to.
Yep. The advent of these mobile devices has just complicated this issue so much.
I would say I would worry about Beaverton as well.
Yeah.
But I think Brad brings up a good point. There's a great disparity in terms of size and resource allocation amongst LEAs, and I think that that chief privacy officer and staff would provide a valuable resource to all K-12 districts, large and small.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you very much, committee. We'll be back in touch in terms of our next meeting, and I'm gaveling out.